And
like that?
really
Yeah.
think that the municipality, that core.
No, you would have to do it.
Sure, I would. I'm getting better at it though.
Personal responsibility then.
Oh, it's under the Honestly, finding that mug is the highlight of this week. I cannot get any better.
It sounds like it's such a special
Hiring another.
It's so ridiculous.
We're hiring another
So
employee.
people should find out.
We're hiring another.
Yeah.
Those ladders
But then the
and
second
that
stage-
dog
Okay.
is so nice. Now if I fall in, I don't have to think to myself, this is it.
Practices that you run the water for several minutes.
I'm going to die. They're so flashy.
Yeah.
Give you a pulse.
So yeah, it's
They look
one of the
really
capital
That's why every
projects.
time you get a glass of water,
It's lots more happening.
They look fantastic. And that new dog, so the day before they put the new dog in, Edward was walking down it towards my dog, and then I saw her stop and kind of go like this, and I looked because that was what was all the way to my dog number. Like a board. Like the day before it was replaced, and I was like, they're replacing it to
Please don't say that.
Yeah, we also.
Yeah, so there's a lot of.
It's better.
I'm pretty good. Yeah.
No, this is hard.
Just us, Britt's not coming tonight, so. No. Was that? Oh.
Although we're within our hedges, we are responsible. Which I was just trying to get into.
Too bad the way it's being supported.
Like, we'll begin.
Right.
So it's a living wage employee, but they're all in
Maybe we're a living wage.
Those specific information. And then there are some that do have a little bit of specific. It seems like the global was really.
pajamas on?
They look kind of like that, don't they? I know, I'm trying to keep up with the styles. It's
Formal
like
pajamas.
different pants, but get some feedback I might have needed them.
I like that formal pajama.
Yeah.
It's all about
Edmonton, Epcor, and a few other places in Prince
Prince
Rupert, one of the places.
Comfortable.
Comfortable, it's an evening meeting. It's a refreshing hands-on.
There's no context, there's no follow-up questions, it was just send us your reports. But maybe if you did something on the post, they follow up with questions.
Maybe.
Did you watch the rugby?
But, you know, it's funny, they're bleating about transparency, but at the same time, no, it's clever.
And I was surprised, a real nice friend of the family. Are they contacting us?
No, it's at 139.
It's,
Maybe they're hoping to come out here.
Andy Gregg, maybe, I mean, it's a story.
Adrian's dad.
Well,
And then didn't happen. Brett and Adrian.
yeah. I haven't think that places like that, any of us are contact because it's
Yeah. Councillor-elect Law, how nice to see you. Enjoy the last time you'll be sitting on that side. Every time I silence my phone. I'll just make sure my phone is on.
Training manual?
I'm meeting Bob this week.
That's the manual he was talking about. It's the meeting with us he needs to worry about. Oh, I thought you made a quick manual joke.
So there's a reminder to everyone to turn their phones off.
This is how we start all committees.
It just doesn't end, does it?
Committee as a whole.
It's like your 2-minute warning, like I gotta make it to the meeting. It just gets better and better.
April, can you like trade seats?
When they're pulling things off.
Hey, Aaron's like
a whole log, and it takes 30 seconds.
I was in the back seat of the car with my dad, and I was where he couldn't reach me.
They fling their arms really hard.
It's like,
Those were different times.
I'm a podcaster, I didn't realize.
Oh, right, you already brought up this stuff.
Seth gets really pissed off.
Well, I'm not pissed off, it's
Well,
just
he does.
weird.
Yeah, that's what he said. Well, actually, he does get happy for some reason.
Oh, where is your podcast? Apparently, Hurwitz doesn't want to work.
Or is it just me?
Turn off.
See, I told you it's not easy.
We can delete your UBCN.
Yeah, I was going to do that.
Okay.
Press hard, yeah, and then it does a little shaky thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, see?
Save you some money or some space. Okay, I'll look after. I'm trying to find this podcast app.
She was gonna look me up.
Scary when we're relying on him to save people at sea and he doesn't know how to use a computer.
I see, I know how to use certain computers.
If he's going to use all of his brain for saving people, I'm okay with that.
Well, that's what, you know, when I say that I don't know how to use these tools, and I'm completely extremely sophisticated all the time. It's just, you know, there's not a problem, but planning would be.
It's a simple thing.
Did you read that one?
What's the comment?
No comment.
Yeah.
Doesn't help.
Yeah, there we go.
Stop that.
No comment.
Something happened while I was in the meeting where it's suddenly like a blank, and I think I lost it.
There's only one thing that went blank.
Thank you, Duncan. I resemble that.
You resemble it?
Yeah.
Okay, now that both clocks say that it's 6 o'clock, I'm going to call this meeting to order. Before we start, I'd like to recognize that we're conducting our meeting here today on the territories of the Clayoquot Nation about business which will be carried out in those self-same territories. I'm grateful to host a meeting and be hosted here. May I have a motion to adopt the agenda, please?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? Motion passed. First order, we have an adoption of the minutes of the Committee of the Whole meeting held August 12th, 2019. May I-
Second.
All in favor? So moved. Next up is public comment, which I did not grab.
There is none.
But I believe there's none, so easy peasy. So we're going to move directly to presentations and reports. First, we have an invited delegation from Rebecca Hurwitz and Brett Freake, the Executive Director and Program Coordinator, respectively from CBT. I'll just briefly remind Council and our audience that this is an invited delegation stemming from the release of CBT's 2019 Living Wage Report, which brought up some questions among Council for further timely discussion. I'll hand it over to you guys.
I have some handouts. Can I hand those out to you?
Thank you.
These are
Not of this
fancy
one.
copies.
These
though.
are the fancy on thick paper.
Got it, yeah.
And they folded?
Yeah.
They folded, thank you, Brett.
Staff? Sure.
My card is not running along.
Okay. Do I click? Is that how that works?
Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you for having us this evening. My name is Brett Freake. I'm the Program Coordinator for Clayoquot Biosphere Trust. And as Councillor McQuaid said, I'm here to talk about the 2019 living wage for the Clayoquot Biosphere region. The living wage has become a key tool for understanding the factors contributing to the high costs of living in our region and is intended to support a vital regional conversation about affordability and quality of life. In this presentation, I'm going to discuss each of the components that make up the living wage calculation and answer any questions you may have. Okay, so the living wage is the hourly pay that each parent must earn to cover the basic expenses of a family of 4 based on local costs once taxes, credits, deductions, and subsidies are taken into account. It considers housing, food, transportation, childcare, healthcare, and is the bare bones a family needs for an adequate quality of life. The living wage is calculated using a standard methodology developed by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives in partnership with First Call BC Child and Youth Advocacy Coalition. It is a regional calculation using the best available data from Hot Springs Cove, Howzit, Tofino, Opitsit, Taistanis, Esowista, Ucluelet, Hidatsu, and Makoa. In 2015, the Clayoquot Biosphere Trust published the first living wage calculation for the Clayoquot Sound Biosphere region to draw attention to local affordability issues faced by families and to inspire action by local employers at all levels of government. The CBT updates the living wage every 2 years. A living wage is not only influenced by employers, but also by economic and social policies that increase affordability for families, such as childcare subsidies and public transit. Yeah, cool. I skipped a page there. Over here. There we go. Okay, so the 2019 living wage for the region is $19.63. Our living wage is now the highest in BC, higher than Vancouver, which is $19.50, and higher than Victoria at $19.39. Our living wage fell 48 cents from the 2017 number, which was $20.11. And despite this increase, monthly family expenses have increased by approximately $300 a month. So the living wage has decreased because of the provincial government's new childcare investments, which are saving BC families thousands of dollars in out-of-pocket costs related to childcare, enough to offset all other increases in the cost of living. The new affordable childcare benefit is reducing costs for up to 80,000 families across the province. Although the cost of living, and particularly the cost of housing, continues to rise, the new childcare investment rolled out by the BC government significantly improves affordability for modest and middle-income families with young children. So all living wage communities across the province saw a decrease in their living wages this year, and that decrease in the living wage demonstrates the power of public policy to improve affordability for families and reduce pressure on employers having to pay high wages. So for housing, housing expenses include the median monthly cost of a 3-bedroom unit in Ucluelet and Tofino, plus utilities and insurance. It also includes the monthly cost of 2 cell phones with the cheapest talk and text plan available, and the monthly cost of internet. The median monthly cost of a 3-bedroom unit in our region is $1,975 a month, and the cost of a 3-bedroom rental unit has increased nearly 50% since 2017. 50%. So for food, food costs represent the monthly cost of healthy eating for a family of 4 living in the central region of Vancouver Island. So that also includes Nanaimo, Parksville, and Port Alberni. It is calculated by the Dietitians of BC and published in their biennial Cost of Eating BC report. The living wage does not capture the additional cost of food on the West Coast. Food costs are up to 12% higher in our region compared to Port Alberni. And from a regional perspective, only 2 of our 9 communities have adequate grocery stores. Transportation costs are calculated based on the monthly cost of owning, operating, and maintaining 1 used vehicle in a rural community based on Statistics Canada's market basket measure. In our region, families rely on a variety of transportation modes, such as water taxi and float planes, and these costs are not captured in the living wage. The living wage framework also includes the cost of a bus pass for the second parent, but since we don't have public transportation system yet in the region, the cost of transportation for the second parent is not captured in this number. So childcare costs represent the monthly cost for a full-time licensed care for a 4-year-old child and after-school and holiday care for a 7-year-old child. In our region, the living wage family saves a total of $11,376 on their child care expenses, a 66% reduction compared to 2017. The child care investments by the province decreased our living wage by $2.84. In 2018, the BC government began piloting a $10 a day child care program in over 50 sites across BC. In this program, families pay a maximum of $200 per month for full-time licensed care. If a $10 a day child care program was implemented universally, our living wage family would save over $500 per month, and our living wage would decrease by 91 cents. It's also worth noting that many families in our region still struggle to access licensed child care services, especially for infants and toddlers and for after-school care. So healthcare costs include the monthly mandatory MSP costs for a family of 3 or more, which reduced by 50% in 2019 and will be completely phased out in 2020. Extended healthcare costs include the monthly cost of the cheapest extended health benefits package with Pacific Blue Cross for a family of 4. For clothing and footwear, the estimated monthly cost for a family of 4 is based on the market basket measure by Statistics Canada. The market basket measure is a measure of low income based on this cost of a specific basket of goods and services representing a modest basic standard of living. The market basket measure takes into account the cost of specific qualities and quantities of food, clothing, footwear, transportation, shelter, and other expenses for a family of 2 adults and 2 children. And the market basket measure is more sensitive than other poverty measures as it accounts for geographical and regional differences in the cost of goods. There's education costs included, which are calculated based on the cost of 2 courses at North Island College, including tuition, books, and student fees. Social participation amount captures the cost of family recreation and entertainment activities. Using the standardized calculation, this amount is set at 75% of the combined cost of food, clothing, and footwear. The contingency fund represents savings for unexpected expenses, such as caring for a sick relative, and is based on 2 weeks of pay for both parents earning the living wage. So again, the living wage is based on a bare bones budget for a family of 4. It is important to remember that it does not include credit card or debt payments, savings for retirement, savings for children's post-secondary education, the cost of owning a home, care for elderly parents, or supporting relatives in need. These are expenses that many families face, but the living wage family would not have the necessary funds to meet these needs. So in our region, many individuals and families receive income assistance. Here you can see the current income assistance rates for each family type. Once approved for income assistance, a couple with 2 children can receive up to roughly $1,300 a month. The gap between what a living wage family needs to earn versus what they are eligible to earn under income assistance is nearly $5,000 a month. Depending on circumstances, there are other expenses that may be covered by income assistance, such as 100% MSP and full pharmacare coverage, which would lower this gap. So while living wage is an optional rate that employers can choose to pay compared to minimum wage, which is the provincially mandated legal minimum employers must pay their employees. The current general minimum wage in BC is $13.85, nearly $6 less than the living wage in our region. It will reach $15.20 per hour in 2021, but this will still not be enough to adequately support West Coast families. The living wage is an amount calculated to reflect the cost of living in a community, whereas the minimum wage is set by the provincial government and is not pegged to inflation or any metric of affordability. As our calculation shows, families cannot afford to get by on the minimum wage. However, the fact that some of this year's living wage communities in BC come closer to the minimum wage highlights the power of good public policy and shows what can happen when governments make bold investments to help BC families. So for those of you who are interested in exploring the idea of District of Tofino becoming a certified living wage employer, I've included some handouts in the package for you that include information from Living Wage Families BC and a sample living wage policy from the District of Central Saanich. So a couple of key points are that in order to become a living wage employer, the employer commits to paying their staff and contractors the local living wage each year. They also mandate that service providers on major contracts pay their staff a living wage as well. The wage can be made up through hourly rates combined with extended health and dental coverage, or MSP premiums, childcare expenses, transportation expenses, professional development, and other benefits. They do not include payments that an employer is mandated by law to provide, such as employment insurance and CPP contributions. So based on that, District of Tofino may already be paying living wages with the benefits that are included. And Living Wage BC can support, they have a calculation system that can take all that information and let you know what the living wage would be based on those benefits. So, and then just moving forward from that, we hope that you'll discuss the living wage with people in your family and employers, other elected officials, and be advocates for policy change. If you want more information after this presentation, there's more information on our website and the Living Wage for Families website as well. And at this point, I'd be happy to answer questions for you if you have any. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Frank. Start here. May I ask one?
Sure. Thank you very much.
No problem.
I'm very interested in Tofino looking into what it would be to become a living wage employer, and I've talked with staff briefly about this a couple of years ago when we had the 2017 report come to us, and I think we're probably really close, but it would take a little bit of analysis, and
Sure.
And I think probably it's the contractor side of things where we'd need the most analysis and looking at it. But then with our upcoming wastewater treatment plant project, living wage and that kind of concept is really part of the social procurement piece that we're doing. So I think it's worth thinking about. I think there are only about 4 municipalities in British Columbia that have gone forward and done it, but there are 2 First Nations as well. Klulet First Nation and Hurwitz First Nation, so I think that's pretty interesting. I'm also curious, this is the 3rd time we've had the living wage? And so every time I read this report, it just makes a little bit more of an impact on me, and I really look at it to see, well, where does the municipality have the ability to change things, or where is the power really? But I wonder too, with the CBTs, you're moving towards having more vital conversations, and if the living wage wouldn't be a great candidate for a regional vital conversation that could take place with leadership from First Nations and municipalities, but to also invite our MP and our MLA who have that insight into policy at the federal and provincial level, because I see a lot of this as being really federally and provincially driven, and there's just a couple of little pieces where I see that we could really have an impact. But just to kind of raise the awareness of all of us in this region, being the region with the highest living wage, it's that's a bit shocking. So there's not really a question in all of that, but a bit of a ramble, sorry.
Councillor Anderson.
My question was around the statistic that the housing went up 50% since 2017, and that is really surprising and shocking even. So what is driving that? Do you know?
Well, I think it's lack of supply.
Yeah.
Supply and demand. So, yeah. Brett collects the housing data from a number of sources, weekly or bi-weekly?
Weekly, yeah.
So that's our method of tracking it.
Yeah.
And like Facebook groups, always just watching what are the rates as well as what is the availability. So it's not just that the rates have increased, it's that the availability has drastically decreased.
Is that based on some combination of mortgage rates and or what people are paying for a mortgage and what people are paying in rent, or Is it just based on rent?
Just based on rent.
So landlords are charging more, basically.
Well, that,
Because they can.
But that's the curious thing, though, that they can't legally. You're mandated by how much you can increase your residential rent at.
3%.
But every time you get a new tenant, you can raise it to whatever.
I'm just, curious as to that. That was one of the questions.
Councillor Shear?
Thank you once again, and just to tell you how this document is used, I just came from a Harbour Authority board meeting where we're using this, we're hiring another employee, and we're using this information to set wage rates within our within the organization. So just to tell you that it is a well-used document. This is more just a general question, but when we up there was talked about what an acceptable quality of life is, and I'm curious as to how that's defined in your document. I mean, it's a statement, but there's no definition as to what and how we might define an acceptable quality of life.
Right, I don't know, I think that kind of comes from Living Wage BC, as their kind of concept of what a acceptable quality of life is, but
I think like the living wage family is able to tread water, essentially. They're not saving a lot of money for the future. They're participating in some social events, but probably not taking big holidays by any means. So it's bare bones in that way.
Councillor Master?
Well, nothing really surprised me with this. Maybe I was a little surprised in what was the lowest in BC and what we're being highest. I just wonder how so many people work in the service industry in this town, how you rationalise minimum wage, living wage and tips. I mean, I know a lot of people that complain about their hourly salary and then they'll tell me they got $300 in tips and all.
Yeah. I think it's a gap in the way that the living wage framework is completed. Like seasonal employment we're not able to address it through that. And likewise, I think it's a gap. So I don't really have a response for you except to say that I think it bears more conversation, and that's the sort of thing that we could do in a vital conversation with folks from different sectors. I know Work BC was interested in co-hosting that with CBT, so it could be a really great opportunity to have some folks who have different employment situations talk about how they're managing their income and how the living wage applies to them.
No, I think that would be really good because so many people are in the service industry.
I know one thing I hear a lot from folks in the service industry and with the cost of daycare is how their strategies at home are that mom and dad work opposite shifts. And so there's very little family time together and there's very little time to volunteer or be active in your community because you're always passing that baton back and forth in terms of being at home or being the lead on the childcare. So.
Thanks. I have to say thank you again for coming. I was definitely really interested to see you speaking here this evening, and I was not surprised by the 50% raise. I think that I've been a part of the rental market for long enough to see that even friends moving into the same location one after another and their rent being higher and higher every time, and I can definitely see that and how that drove that 50%. One of the things that Councillor Steer, you indicated to an acceptable standard of living, and Councillor McMaster's indication towards the tension between being a service worker who makes a lot in tips, I think points to kind of the tension between those two things and an anxiety and an uncertainty that you can make $300 a night during the summer and then be paid a non-living wage and walk out the door with $30 in the winter. And so I'd be really interested to see in a vital conversation like how that evens out over a year and where you end up. It would require a really honest conversation with service workers that I think most of them would be unwilling to have in daylight, and I think would probably have to be like an anonymous type survey. but yeah, I think that anxiety of poverty is something that is less tangible that we can put our finger on, but I think everything that's indicated to here kind of guides us in that direction. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to hear more. Anyone would like to speak a second time?
Yeah, thanks.
Mayor Osborne?
So Rebecca and I had a little bit of email back and forth where I was asking her if she had any insight into how inflation is factored into this. And when you look at the monthly expenses in 2017 and you compare them to 2019, despite the fact that the provincial childcare changes have brought down what it would have been otherwise, if you account for inflation, it's actually exactly the same. And so I don't know if you had a chance, or maybe we can follow up with Iglika or somebody from the CCPA to talk about what what role does inflation play in the narrative? Because it's really easy to say, oh wow, the monthly living expenses have jumped in 2 years, but if you account for inflation, they haven't. Despite that, we know wages aren't keeping up with the cost of living, and so there's a whole other conversation to unravel into that. But.
Yeah, I think we haven't heard back. It'd be great to have that conversation all together, I think with her on the phone, or that would be ideal. I think it's important to remember that the living wage allows us to compare with other places in BC and across Canada. So, and because we're all using the same framework, it does allow for good comparison.
It sure does.
And yeah.
And then I'm just curious if anybody else is interested in, do you want to pursue any further the notion of the District of Tofino being a certified living wage employer? And we could ask our staff to just look into it and see what it would take. I don't want to burden you with lots of extra work, but it would take a conversation with the living wage for families.
I think to gather the data, that would take a considerable amount of time because we don't get wage information from the contractors currently.
Right.
So to go back in time to have a look at that, I think would be our biggest challenge.
Right.
Quite time consuming. To look at our own wages, that's fairly straightforward.
I mean, I guess I would ask what the benefit of an official council. I mean, like
I just think it sets a tone and it establishes some leadership in saying that we recognize that it's expensive to live here and that we want to be a certified living wage employer. We could also, I mean, as elected officials, we certainly can talk to the other jurisdictions that have done so and talk to the nations to see why. I don't know, and it would be interesting to talk to the folks at the Living Wage for Families campaign office to find out like how far back do they really need you to go. If you go back into 1 year's contractors' wages and find out that it's pretty close to that, then it might not be as much work as we think it might be. But yeah, we briefly danced around this 2 years ago, so I'm bringing it back to say, are we ready to do something about it or not?
I think it's an awesome opportunity to show leadership and to show response to the data. And my understanding was that the contractors that are currently under contract would be grandfathered in, essentially, and it's just new contracts that would be negotiated at a living wage. And so it might not be as onerous. I think that the folks at the campaign would be really helpful in just like fielding questions and having that first conversation about it.
I'm interested in having a look into it. I'm just mindful of, I kind of want to give it a lower priority than the budget that staff is currently tasked with. So maybe over the course of a year or something, we could fit it in or something like that. But I'm always wary of just sort of lobbing new jobs in there.
Is it possible to start record, like as opposed to going back and seeing if we qualify, can we start now? And in a year we'll have information from the past year?
Well, like Rebecca said, I think that there is a clause in there about existing contracts, ongoing contracts get grandfathered in, and it's kind of moving forward.
Yeah, I think my mind went to going back in time to have a look at what contractors have paid comes from me wanting to do an analysis of if we were to do this, what would that
what would the impact be?
And so if we wanted to start now going forward just in terms of collecting the data for the next year, for example, and making it a requirement to indicate what the wage rates are for the different employees. We could do that to start gathering statistics and compiling the information in a year's time. We could have a look at that. That would be one approach that would take a lot less time.
I think she's giving us a door.
Do we have an appetite for that on council? Can we, Mayor Osborne, would you like to refer that to staff?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, so maybe I could make a motion to refer the living wage certification to staff with, making stuff up now.
Yeah, I think essentially we want to make it a requirement
Right.
in contracts going forward to indicate wages. I mean, some contractors, I don't know if they would, but that would be a starting point.
Yeah, so the motion would be then maybe to and we're in committee, so it's going to come back to council anyways, right? But to refer this to staff and direct them to collect contract wage information for the next year and then report back to council. How's that?
Wonderful. Any further?
Is there a second?
Is there a second? I'll second that. Any further discussion? All in favor? Motion passed. Great, thank you. I actually do have one further, just a methodology question, if you wouldn't mind. With the proposed addition of public transport to this region, can I ask, does that, what does that do to cost of living? Do you add the cost of a bus pass? What assumptions do you make? Because it's entirely possible that somebody may cease to own a car and take a bus. How do you go about navigating that?
Yeah,
No pun intended.
I think what happens there is just that the cost of the bus pass for the second parent is added, but that it takes away that that question around how is the other parent. The assumption is that the other parent isn't getting around by vehicle, that they're using bike or foot or whatever, or they're adjusting their schedule. So it just kind of takes away some of that lack of clarity, I guess.
Thank you very much for that. Are there any further questions? Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, Barbara.
When's the next vital sign zone?
I don't know, we're just in the middle of contemplating if we're going to do a report next year or not. In part because there's not a lot of new data available, and so we'd rather do more with the data and the report that we've already published, and so that's why we're thinking about more vital conversations, perhaps around living wage, climate change, some other topics. Awesome.
Okay, come and talk to you.
Okay, come and talk to us, that would be great. Also, there's a video, Faye made a video about the living wage calculation on our website, so if you know of other folks like the Harbour Authority Board would like to know more about how the calculation is created, it's very similar to the presentation you just had.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's 2/3 of our audience.
There we go.
It's all on you now, Dan. Next up is our presentation for financial services. The debt policy, which I'm so excited about. Oh man! Thought about it all afternoon.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm going to begin a discussion regarding the debt policy. So in your packages today, you didn't have a drafted council debt policy or municipal debt policy. I have started drafting the policy, but I require more information from council, more general information from council in terms of guiding principles to help me complete an initial draft of the policy, which I will be bringing forward to council for more discussion, and there will be an opportunity to amend it some more. So approaching this topic was overwhelming to me, and so I wanted to put frames around the conversation and make it easier to digest, easier to approach for everybody, and figure out a way to move forward to tackle this topic as we encounter it going forward. So borrowing decisions are big decisions, and they're often complicated. particularly the one that we just made. And so by not just having guiding principles, but having some strategies to deal with these bigger decisions, I think are going to help us in the long run and assist us with some longer term financial planning that we're being required to do. So the presentation tonight, I'll take us through the purpose of a debt policy, and we've gone there before, but I think it's just good to remind us because we haven't talked about this for a while. I go back to the concept we started talking about in the budget meeting last week regarding financial principles and some strategies to help us deal with some of these bigger decisions like debt decisions and borrowing decisions. I will take us through what our current debt position is and what our structure of current debt is and how we have been making borrowing decisions and where we might want to go when we start to make new borrowing decisions. So I'll talk about the policy components, and there'll be some discussion points in there that would help me move forward and draft the policy. Then I'll talk about some next steps and then go over some resources that I use that I am using to help develop the policy in today's discussion. So what is a debt policy? I think we're all fairly familiar. It's going to not make specific decisions for us when we're faced with a specific borrowing decisions, but it's going to help us guide us through that decision-making process. It's going to set guidelines and restrictions with respect to the amount and the type of debt that we will allow ourselves to enter into, how we'll manage that debt, and what is our optimal debt structure. Short-term versus long-term, or do we short-term borrow at all? Do we only long-term borrow? And those are some areas that we haven't discussed before, and they certainly don't expect us to get through those discussions this evening. But I think it's important to start to ask ourselves these questions as we talk through the policy development. So why is having a debt policy a good idea? We know it's a best practice, and we know municipalities have debt policies. But why is it important, and why should we have one? It's important to make consistent decisions, especially when we're faced with big decisions like borrowing. And if we have a policy in place, it's going to improve our quality of decisions because it'll encourage us to be consistent with how we decide to borrow. It will provide justifications for the structure of debt. If we establish what our optimal debt structure would look like, then it'll encourage us to move in that direction and not in another direction that doesn't make sense for our organization. It'll identify policy goals, what our credit objectives are, and what our risk tolerance is. We talk a lot about risk, and we identify that there is risk in certain decisions, but we haven't really talked about what our tolerance is, particularly with respect to debt. And risk comes up in many different decisions and a lot of big decisions that we talk about and around, but it's important for us to, as I said earlier, frame it a little bit and make those decisions easier for us. So with risk tolerance, we're mostly talking about here is what are our limits to borrowing. We know our maximum every year that we could borrow, but do we ever want to reach that level? And so that's kind of what we'll talk about throughout this discussion. Having a debt policy demonstrates a commitment to long-term financial planning. We need to start planning beyond 5 years for financial planning. We're going to start reviewing our OCP, or we are in the process of reviewing our OCP. We're going to develop development cost charges or review our development cost charges, and we only have a 5-year financial plan. So all of these big decisions are going to move us forward and encourage us to plan more long-term over a 20-year term or a 30-year term to match up with some of the debt decisions that we're making. A debt policy demonstrates a well-managed organization. It's an organization that has a process in mind with respect to this big decision of borrowing. It provides guidance to staff, council, and the public, and it sets the roles and responsibilities of all those individuals. It's going to help me come to council and know how to advise council on a big decision with respect to borrowing. It's going to help council make decisions regarding that, and it's going to tell the community what their role is with respect to these decisions, because they certainly do have an opinion and a role, and how can we get the community involved in some of these bigger decisions. So setting the debt policy aside for a moment, but keeping in mind, I just want to go back to this concept of establishing a set of financial principles for our municipality. When I started working on this policy, I decided that I was going to look to larger municipalities to see what they were doing with respect to borrowing decisions, because their decisions regarding borrowing were significantly more higher than ours would be. However, relatively speaking, $60 million borrowing decision for us is a huge decision. So how can we do better at making those decisions? And so that's where I started. And I landed with a document from the City of Kelowna. City of Kelowna has a population of over 130,000, and they have $120 million in debt issued currently. So their borrowing limits are much higher, but how did they get to that point, and how did they make those decisions? And when it came down to it, it was actually quite simple. And they have 5 established principles, which I have up here on the screen. I'll talk through in a moment and what it means for them. But they were very intuitive principles, and they were very simple. So what occurred to me is that we need to simplify this process. We need to simplify our decision making while keeping in mind that these are very complex decisions that we're faced with. So when considering financial decisions like this one, council and staff must balance a set of financial principles. So we may not achieve all these guiding principles or be able to meet the goals of all of them, but we should be keeping them in mind and alongside us when we're making big borrowing decisions, asset additions, development cost charges, partnership agreements, and I'll talk through some of those more in a moment with more of a focus on debt. So I just want to talk through a few of these principles and relate them back to the decisions that we have made to date, particularly regarding debt. But the 5 principles are sufficiency, pragmatic, flexibility, transparency, and balance. So sufficiency, and this just may seem so straightforward, but we need to always make sure that we have adequate revenues and expenditures to meet our commitment to the service levels that we have been providing and would like to continue to provide. So when we're making long-term borrowing decisions, how would that impact this sufficiency principle? And then we can always go back to that and ask ourselves that question. If it's going to impact and we won't have enough revenues to meet the expenditures, well then that makes us stop and sort of think about that. Pragmatic, and I think that we do this naturally, is we always talk about, as I mentioned, what risk is involved in this decision making, but we need to learn to manage that risk. There is a level of risk that we will be comfortable with, but there is a certain level that we don't want to go past. And so we need to manage what that risk is, and we need to make sure that if we make a borrowing decision, how is this going to impact the district service levels that we've committed to provide to the community? So we don't want to compromise one principle for another, or we don't want to give up one principle to justify another. We need to find a way to make these principles work together when we make these larger decisions. Flexibility, we have to ensure that financial policies allow for opportunities and changing circumstances, and we always have the ability to respond. And this has become quite apparent, not just over the last 10 years that I've been here, but I think we can all agree that over the last several decades, technology has forced us to make sure that we are adaptable and we need to be ready to change. And being a municipality, perhaps we're a little bit slower than we're able to be in the other sectors, but we need to keep responding and growing and changing with the economy as well as technology. So we need to make sure that our policies aren't so restrictive, particularly our debt policy, so that we can't achieve some of these community goals that we need to achieve. Transparency. Financial strategies, plans, and processes must be accessible and visible, because that essentially builds a strong community. So not having a debt policy, I think, has disadvantaged us a little bit in going through this big borrowing decision, because we didn't have anything to show to the community to say, these are our guiding principles, this is what we're using to make this big decision, and then that provides a level of confidence to the community and helps build a stronger community. And balance is the last one. Service levels must be affordable and appropriate, and we need to balance the level of service and the cost of service. So if we are going to borrow, have a wastewater treatment plant, or borrow and have an indoor recreation facility, we need to make sure that that level of service and the cost of service is acceptable for our community. So by having these principles alongside us when we're making borrowing decisions for the wastewater treatment plant, for the indoor rec facility, I think would help frame our conversations. And so I would like to get there and include some of these guiding principles in our debt policy, but I would also like to come back and revisit this for some other decisions that we're going to be faced with and that we're currently deciding on right now. So financial management strategies are getting more into the details. So we have these overarching principles, but then we need strategies to help us make decisions regarding development cost charges, debt. We know whether we want to apply for a large grant or not and what that would mean for our service levels going forward. We need a set of strategies to help us make these large decisions. It may feel right to enter into a partnership agreement, for example, but is it the right decision? And does it meet the principles that we've established for ourselves? Reserves and surpluses is another one, and we'll be having a look at a policy there, and we'll be revisiting if we have established principles by then, having a look at those, and then establishing objectives in that policy to make sure that we are making those decisions easier and transparent for the community. User fees and charges is another one, and we continue to look at user fees and charges and making sure that we're meeting principles naturally, but we really need to make sure that we do have a balance there with respect to the cost of service and whether it's doable for the community. So as I talk through the rest of this presentation, I'll be incorporating some of the strategies that I think that we can use when we're making decisions on borrowing. I just want to go over how we've currently been borrowing and how I see us moving forward with borrowing based on our current financial structure. So our general fund debt is our operational debt, it's our shorter term debt. And so debt servicing has remained low in the past, and it currently is, in order to ensure that annual debt payments are reasonable and that it allows a lot of room for future borrowing should we need to. So we needed to make sure the capacity was there to borrow for these big projects, like the wastewater treatment plant and potentially an indoor rec facility. We also always need to have the ability to respond to emergent opportunities or events. And by having some debt capacity always and not moving as far as our borrowing limit will ensure that we always have that capacity in place. We've always had low reliance on debt in the general fund, and we will continue to see that because of the introduction of the capital and infrastructure levy. So perhaps I should have said this first, but general fund debt is typically paying for us for equipment, fire truck, the fleet vehicles, and we have used it for housing, for some staff housing. So we are relying less and less on that because we aren't necessarily growing our fleet significantly, or we're typically replacing equipment, larger pieces of equipment, and aren't taking on new housing. So we are less relying on that and using the infrastructure levy to replace some of these assets that we have. So I don't see our general fund debt increasing significantly unless we decide we, for example, want to increase our service levels. We'll just say double the fire department or something like that, in which case we need to increase the fleet. Then we would need to borrow funds to pay for equipment. So based on our current decision making, I don't see us exceeding or increasing that general fund borrowing. Long-term debt, we don't have a lot of that. We have borrowed for a reservoir, and there's still several years left in that term. We have made a decision to borrow for the wastewater treatment plant, and then, as council knows, we have a borrowing bylaw at third reading for the indoor recreation facility. So typically our use of debt has been to fund one-time major capital requirements. And that is a policy statement. That is, if we would like to continue to borrow in this manner, that is something we should be putting in our policy. So going back to the principles, when we're making these borrowing decisions, when we're deciding on whether for long-term borrowing we want to save it for long-term major capital requirements, and we want to minimize the borrowing in the general fund for short-term borrowing, does that meet the principles that we've established for ourselves? I'm not saying these are our only principles and where we'll start, but just to reflect back on the concept of having principles. So a debt policy, just to talk about the components of the policy, we'll consider guiding principles should we choose to establish some, and we certainly do need to do that for the purposes of our debt policy. And what I am doing is I'm going back historically and looking at how decisions have been made and trying to establish some principles that fit well with us based on the past decisions that we've made. And I will be proposing some language to the council, certainly for consideration only, and hopefully for some further discussion. Debt limits and debt structure. How do we want to borrow? I think we need to look at our debt structure. What will we borrow for? Are there going to be any restrictions? Is there anything on the table that we just absolutely will not borrow for? Though that's the kind of language we want to include in a policy, or that's the kind of item we want to include in a policy. What will our limits be for each type of debt? Are we going to use the statutory limit, or are we only comfortable with going lower than that, and what percentage of that? We want to decide who's responsible for what in this policy and provide any relevant definitions if there are any. So this next few slides I may pause and have some discussion or ask council how they're feeling about some of the language and the strategies that I've included in these next few slides. So how do we want to borrow? So short-term borrowing, general fund borrowing is currently done through Municipal Finance Authority, and I think everyone's familiar with that authority. We are required to borrow through MFA for long-term borrowing. For short-term borrowing, that's been our preference because the rates are significantly lower than anything else we've been able to achieve anywhere else. The debt balance as of December 31st in the general fund was $291,076. So comparatively, for a municipality of our size and our operations and our revenues, that is quite low. And I'm okay with that. Do we want to continue to borrow through equipment financing for new equipment additions? Do we want to, for all renewals of equipment, can those be funded through the capital and infrastructure levy? Now, I've included that language up there because logically, I think we want to continue to give ourselves the ability to borrow short term should we need to, but we want to set parameters around that. So based on past decision making, I would recommend for our debt policy is to continue to have access to that equipment financing, but for new equipment additions only, and to expand service levels only. To meet our current service level needs, we have established the capital and infrastructure levy for an existing assets. And so as a policy objective or statement, I think we would want to be tapping into those funds that we are taxing for and minimizing short-term borrowing and using that money to purchase new equipment. So where possible, we would use internal financing, so reserve funds, for wherever possible for less than 5 years of borrowing. We may get to a point where we're quite savvy in that and have the time and attention to be able to borrow from one reserve fund that we've established for infrastructure levy for a specific category. No, we won't need it for another 20 years, but a shorter term equipment or asset replacement has come up, so we may be able to borrow internally through our reserve funds in that way. Building our reserve funds allows us to internally finance that way, and we haven't had that opportunity yet, but that's where we're heading. So debt servicing costs is another factor that we want to consider. We want to make sure that they're remaining low or below a targeted level. So for example, in 2018, the level was 6.8% of 2018 taxation. And that may not be our most appropriate target level. Revenues are increasing from year to year, so just on that's on $4.2 million of taxation. That's 6.8%, but as we know, taxation is increasing, so we don't want to make that percentage too high, but we don't want to make it too low because our revenues are changing from year to year. So I need to do a bit of work on figuring out what our target levels should be based on this next financial planning period and what our tax increases are going to look like and what our revenues are going to look like. I'll come back to council with a more appropriate percentage if we want to set a target level there. Now I'm going to pause there for a moment because that was a lot of information, and I know this is a difficult conversation to have. But just to summarize, this slide is just regarding short-term borrowing. How we would want to continue to short-term borrow. Is what we're doing right now appropriate, and we want to continue that way? Do we want to set a target level against taxation, for example? And so I would really like to turn it back to the committee to have some discussion about this before I move on.
The long-term debt threshold, you mean? The last part you just spoke about?
This is for short-term.
Okay, for short-term. Okay.
Yeah,
Do we
short-term
wanna
only,
set it?
and we'll talk about long-term in a moment, because that's a
Okay.
much bigger discussion.
That, what you call debt servicing costs includes principal and interest payments both, or?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And I sort of wonder if there might be a different, how do you go for that percentage? Is it different in a large community, small community? Do we have any comparisons to go out there and base it on?
We definitely do, but because it's based on the revenue, then it's going to change significantly from municipality to municipality. And you know, I'm very cautious when I compare to other municipalities because the difference in operations, service levels. However, this measurement seems to be used, and it seems to be used effectively. But what we really need to look at is historically what it's been for us and why it's been that way. So for me, when I looked at that, I thought we haven't been charging the levy to the degree that we need to, but we're getting to that point. Right. So more reliance on the capital and infrastructure levy means less reliance on borrowing. So I don't want that percentage to go too high. And so the general concept of using that percentage is something that I would like to gauge council's interest on, but coming up with that optimal or target level and percentage, I would very much feel comfortable setting and recommending to council. And it's something, this is a policy we will be reviewing every 3 years consistently. It's to our advantage to do so. So when we set that percentage, it's not going to be set in stone for 20 years or 30 years. It'll be a dynamic policy in which we have to keep revisiting and checking in to see if that works for us.
And I like it. You've made it very clear to us, especially for new councillors, the importance of building those reserve funds that we may not have been as a community as forthright on that as we could have in the past. And so we, you know, I think last year's our municipal tax burden, that 4% of that was for those, basically the reserve funds for the, and we're very supportive, I think. My question would be in the relationship between continuing to build those reserve funds and the tax. We had a conversation about the language about the tax burden, which I'm not sure I'm comfortable with the word burden, but that revenue that we would need to generate. I somehow would like to be able to use that in my thinking, because it is one area that we have obviously some flexibility in terms of the tax load that we put onto the individual, and how I can understand how the borrowing aspect, when we're you know, we want to lessen that burden of the borrowing by creating these funds, but at the same time there is a cost to the taxpayer for that, and trying to figure out how I can balance that, because I want to be able to have the flexibility in time to be able to say I'd like to, instead of always saying we want more money from you, to be able to say here's a time that we're getting close to those, and that we can start looking at possibly lowering that which I think we found a middle ground in that sort of area of borrowing or taxing for that levy. And is there some, do you know where I'm going with this?
I do.
Yeah.
So long-term borrowing discussion, which we'll have in a moment, is very different from the short-term borrowing discussion in that the assets that we're having to renew more frequently are these items that I'm talking about: equipment, fleet vehicles, those kinds of things. So borrowing less for that and using the capital and infrastructure levy is a responsible way to make decisions. It's better planned, it's well managed, and it's usually happening in 5 years or less. With the infrastructure levy, looking out long-term, and when we talk about long-term borrowing, which we will go into more detail in a moment, we are going to factor in some borrowing into how much we should charge with that capital infrastructure levy as we go through the years. We're getting to an optimal level by 2023, as we've said to the community, and we've included in our financial plan. But that optimal level includes a portion of borrowing. It includes the ability to apply for grants. It's not strictly just using the infrastructure levy to replace every piece of infrastructure we have when it's end of life. So I think that's balanced in the long-term discussion and the long-term borrowing decision making. With short-term, I think we should heavily rely on the capital and infrastructure levy to 100% of the renewal of these assets, because that's on a much smaller scale. Does that somewhat answer that?
It does, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
The renewal of them, but not the initial purchase.
The initial
of them,
purchase, yeah.
which is more responsive to like a service level change, and we decide we need to add
That's
to
right.
our.
Yeah.
Councillor Anderson?
It's hard to frame the questions I have. Is there a big, or an interest rate difference between short-term and long-term that would affect how we set the policy?
There is a difference. Short-term borrowing can be lower. Right now, we are seeing it lower than long-term, because if it's spread over a long period of time, there's risk that it could fluctuate. So you plan for an average higher interest rate. But for 5 years or less, we are seeing it lower.
Is there a follow-up question?
I guess another question I had was, how common is it to have a debt policy?
Extremely.
What's
common.
that?
It's extremely common.
Yeah.
For municipalities, we should have a debt policy. Yeah.
Because that was one question. I would imagine a lot of small communities don't have one, and they sort of just respond to needs and that they have at the moment. But
No, a lot of smaller municipalities do. I mean, the majority of municipalities are technically smaller municipalities in BC, not as small as us, but and so we look to the larger municipalities to set our practice and to help us with this policy setting. But more and more, the smaller municipalities are realizing, I mean, this is a policy that I think it warrants a good discussion with council, and we are finding that we are borrowing to an uncomfortable level. So I think it's a good policy to have in place to help us with that decision, or those decisions. Yeah.
Councillor Pastor?
Probably missed that the Municipal Government Act dictates how much debt you can take on, right?
It's in regulation, but yeah, they're all tied together, and it points to the regulation to help us do the calculation. And the limit will change from year to year based on your previous year's revenue. Responding to Councillor Anderson, I think you'll find most small municipalities in Alberta have a debt policy. I definitely think it's a good idea, and I would suspect this is going to tie into your asset management plan, because you don't believe you would have your debt payments exceeding the lifetime of your asset. Yeah, we can't.
Yeah.
We can't. We're actually prohibited from being able to have it longer than the lifetime. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. No, I mean, I'm fully supportive. It's I'd need to look at some more debt policy in some various communities, but yeah, it needs to be done. We should be doing it. We're at that stage.
Okay.
Thanks. Yes, so I agree, and I think that while it makes sense to me that the short-term borrowing that's tied into changing the service levels that we're providing the community stays, we're using the general fund to borrow from, and then additional borrowing on top of that if needed. and then you move those assets into to renew them under the C&I levy. So long as there's still some kind of responsiveness, so when you change service levels, you might be able to move things out, so to speak. So just because it gets added into the base doesn't mean that the base continues to grow without really looking at the service levels. And because we're going to do a service level review this year, next year, it seems like that these kind of develop together a little bit.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it makes sense to me, because so long as that general fund is big enough that it's sufficient, it's got to meet the test of sufficiency to be able to do that. And yeah, no, I understand.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. And this is just starting to develop the language and see, what council's thoughts are on it. When we see it in a policy, it's going to look different, it's going to feel different, and as we see that and discuss that, we can modify the language, and of course keeping in mind that it needs to be flexible so we can be responsive. I completely agree. Okay.
I'm happy to continue.
Okay, so now for the harder part is the long-term borrowing discussion.
Easy one.
We've done it. So for long-term borrowing, we are required to borrow through Municipal Finance Authority, and fortunately the rates through MFA are great, and we have the benefit of that. So the balance of long-term borrowing as of December 31st was $799,000. So this has been managed so that it's limited to fund one-time major capital projects. So we've long-term borrowed for the reservoir. We've just made a decision to borrow for the wastewater treatment plant. We are considering the indoor rec facility. So what happens after we put these infrastructure items in place, then we need to plan for the replacement of those assets. And we take the components of those assets, the wastewater treatment plant I'm thinking of, we break it down, we break down the service life, and they become renewed at different stages throughout the lifespan. We don't replace it all in 60 years or whichever. We have been using it that way, but we also need to consider unplanned or emergent projects. So that would be when an asset does not last the intended service life or the expected service life. What do we do because we haven't saved enough money in the capital and infrastructure levy to replace that asset? We need to leave room in our borrowing capacity to replace that item because we can't live without it. If grants funds are insufficient but the item needs to be replaced, we're going to need to borrow. And if reserve funds are insufficient. So those are the two that would dictate our decision making. So we need to make sure for long-term borrowing, the language in our policy is flexible so we can respond to these types of items. So essentially, we have been preserving our debt capacity for when it is truly needed for the wastewater treatment plant. And I think we would like to continue to reserve capacity for that. And so that's why I've said maybe we want to have less reliance for short-term borrowing and sort that out through the capital and infrastructure levy and move it over here and under long-term borrowing and preserve that capacity for when we need it for these items. So I'm going to pause there and see what council thinks about this language and just your general thoughts on that.
I'm good. Councillor Anderson?
No,
I'm happy with it.
good with that.
Okay, Bob was right, that was easy.
Yeah, I guess one thing. I'm just thinking about other pieces of infrastructure, like roads, or would that be a major capital project or not? Because I could see that water and wastewater infrastructure, there's major parts of that, but what about replacing or building a new section of line or something like that?
So expanding.
What's major?
Yeah, I think
is it major because it's part of a major infrastructure?
Yeah, I guess what I had in mind when I was writing this out was the wastewater treatment plant. I don't think it's gonna ever get as major as that. So I think when we're looking at new additions to our infrastructure that are significant, we're gonna have to look to borrowing to help us out with that, like we have had to for the wastewater treatment plant. If we want to add a new facility for recreation, we're going to have to look to borrowing because we simply will not have the reserve funds to help us pay for that. You know, we're going to look to grant funds, but likely we're going to have to contribute some of our resources. So a major piece of infrastructure is going to be like a wastewater treatment plant. If we're going to expand our roads or going to expand our infrastructure, we should be looking to development cost charges initially to make sure that we use those funds, utilize those funds, and then use borrowing. And so there'll be several sources of funds that we will consider. I won't be indicating those sources of funds in our debt policy because they are always changing, and we don't need to include that language in the policy. But the debt policy doesn't mean we're restricting ourselves to using debt only. It's just going to help dictate how we're going to make decisions when a major piece of infrastructure like these ones we're seeing right now are coming up.
Or potentially a new municipal hall. Just thought I'd throw that in there, Bob.
Don't tease.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll begin with this language in the debt policy with respect to long-term borrowing, and we can play with the language a little bit or discuss it when it comes forward. So another discussion point is how we want to repay debt, and this may seem like an easy answer. Well, we're going to tax and we're going to repay the debt, but we may find ourselves in a situation where we have money to purchase a piece of infrastructure. We also have the ability to repay the debt early. So how do we move forward? Should we take out new debt, and should we repay our existing debt? That would be dependent on what the interest rates were at when we borrowed initially and what they are currently. So we will be faced with those decisions, and will debt be paid down as early as possible? Maybe not always, but we want to give ourselves that flexibility and language in the policy so we can make those decisions at a council level should we need to, with me advising council on the current economic climate interest rates. We want to balance the repayment of debt in all funds, so fees versus taxation. Where possible and practicable, use fees to repay debt in the water and the sewer fund when we have the fees and the ability to do so. So we're looking at establishing, well, we're going to refer to our principles, should we establish them, and the guiding principles in the policy to help us make decisions if we are faced with a scenario where we could repay the debt earlier than the term of the borrowing. So the key here will be for us to use flexible language, and we want to make sure we're not too restrictive and that we're planning effectively in our financial planning documents, our long-term financial planning documents, to make this type of decision making possible should we be faced with that. I guess another important point to note is just because this language is in a debt policy, it won't be for staff to make this decision, because this type of decision would come forward during the financial planning process. If we wanted to highlight an opportunity to repay the debt 10 years early, for example, and we knew a borrowing opportunity was coming up, we would bring this to council through the financial planning process and seek council's authorization before doing so. And we need to decide what we will borrow for, and typically we borrow for critical infrastructure, we've borrowed for a reservoir, we've borrowed for a wastewater treatment plant. We haven't adopted the bylaw for the recreation facility, but we have considered it. So where do we want our limits to borrowing? Where do we want that to be? And we need to talk about two things. One is what we will borrow for, what we will include in our policy. And we also need to talk about what are our limits to borrowing in terms of dollar amounts. Not specific dollar amounts, but we will refer to our borrowing limit and what our comfort level and risk tolerance is with respect to that. So the first part is where are we willing to go for borrowing? Critical infrastructure systems only, such as water, roads, sewer, and drainage. We want to expand that out to recreation services, for the multi-use path, for facilities, for parks, for buildings and structures like the municipal hall or any other facilities we may have, the First Street dock or any other docks we may own. When we should consider maximums in each category if we are willing to put all these categories into the policy. For example, recreation facility borrowing up to a maximum of 33% of total project costs, or for critical infrastructure, borrow up to a maximum of 75% of project costs where grants and reserve funds are not available. So that's some example of policy language we could use. And I don't feel comfortable deciding or drafting into a policy which of these items council will borrow for. And so I would like to open it up for discussion to, so I can receive some guidance on that.
Well, I just, like, the items obviously input, but in terms of the percent borrowing, the maximum percent borrowing, I suspect probably you might have some,
yes,
some good.
Yeah, I can help with that language for
Yeah.
sure. And what I'll base that on is historically what has been available to us for grants or what's currently available to us.
I was thinking, yeah, 27%, 73%, so anyway.
This is interesting, and I think it is a really important conversation because it will express our views about kind of a tiered view of what is really critical and what is not, and what municipalities are responsible for, and what municipalities expect senior levels of government to pay into. So I don't actually think this is going to be a very easy discussion, and we're going to have mixed views about, you know, how much would we be willing to borrow for these things, because a person could argue that a recreation facility where a community has none is as critical as delivering water and sewer is to the functioning of the community. And yeah, so this will be interesting, and I'll be interested to know how other policies work in other smaller communities too. And I don't know, we're just kind of subject to the vagaries of other levels of government and what parties decide is important during different terms where we're served by different political parties that put money into different things. I also think this is something where, you know, our financial planning is over 5 years, and we've talked about the value in extending that. And so if we have an OCP that always lasts longer than we intend it to, if we have a strategic plan that we start to actually push out beyond 3 or 5 years, or the length of the municipal term, and we begin to match that with some expectations of where we're going to be borrowing, we would probably be able to more accurately kind of say to the community, we think that we will need to borrow 50% for these kinds of facilities that are going to come down 10 years from now, say. But I don't know.
Yes, yeah. And to your point of these, you know, our priorities and opportunities changing, that stresses the importance of revisiting this policy regularly.
Yeah.
I mean, every 3 years, if we're doing a 10-year financial plan or a 20-year financial plan, we're going to have to revisit our policies before we would adopt a document like that to make sure it aligns well with what we're planning over the next 10 to 20 years, even the next 5 years. So this could be a policy that comes up as the political landscape changes, grant opportunities change. And we know historically we've seen a lot of grants in the area of roads, water, and sewer, but that may change. And so I think that we would want to continue to revisit this policy. What we would want to avoid is amending the policy so that it suits a current decision that we want to make. And so that's the importance of that flexibility principle, and that it has to be responsive.
I think as some infrastructure or projects, whatever assets that would be borrowed for, have more of an ability through fees to help service the debt as well. So that might change how we categorize the maximums of
Possibly.
as well.
Yeah, I think we would want the language to be flexible so that that maximum level gives us room to make decisions like that.
And the other thing, what was the other thing I was thinking? Oh, the fact that we have to go to a referendum in certain borrowing situations or alternative process. But I'm wondering if some of that requirement for referendum, or we might want to set that requirement differently around different categories too. I don't know. Like that's a political thing, and that's a tougher discussion. Like, what if you wanted to say, well, for docks, we're going to go for a referendum no matter what we borrow for a dock or something, or any categories or specific ones might end up looking at that requirement too. Does that make sense at all?
It does make sense. I guess my initial thoughts are I would be concerned with indicating in this policy which items we would get approval from electors for. I think we have, we have different acts that help us make those decisions on whether we do have to or don't have to, or do or don't. I think we should leave. My initial thought is to just leave that as a policy. I think setting maximums or even establishing categories in the policy will help us. It will help us to just help us decide whether we could consider borrowing for a project. So then there's the discussion of, is this project viable without borrowing, or is it not? And I fully recognize and did when I put this in the slides today that this is a conversation that will continue to happen, and likely, when I get the first draft to council of this policy, it may not establish the categories, but it could indicate where in the policy we could establish that, and will give us an opportunity to discuss this again. This is a big consideration. We don't know how the best way to frame it, and we certainly don't want to rush this. And I'm happy to give time for this. We can have more thought, and we can consider how to exactly draft this in the policy.
Maybe it's getting too formulaic then, rather than being
more of
a decision-making tool to weigh things out.
Yeah.
That will come forward, not a like whatever.
Well, from where I used to live, which is smaller than Tofino, for debt you were only allowed to borrow for infrastructure projects, and everything else then had to come before council and the electorate. And I kind of like that, because I think as soon as you have a big cookie jar that you can keep on borrowing for things, people tend to dip into it more. So knowing what we're faced on the horizon, I tend to prefer that if we're going to establish a policy, that the policy should state that we borrow for infrastructure projects, and anything else will be considered on a case-by-case basis.
How would you define infrastructure? Like, I mean, I just see critical
water, roads,
infrastructure.
sewer, and drainage.
Yeah, but something such as a dock, which could be considered infrastructure, or a municipal, or a
That's not capital projects.
or a rec center.
That's still not infrastructure. I don't consider that infrastructure. You can come and when I say bring up the rec centre and come on a case-by-case basis and take it to the electorate as to whether they want to borrow.
Can I ask to what extent this aligns with, for example, like we should be thinking of this in terms of our strategic plan? Because when I originally read through this, my intimation was to be like, these health and wellness and these things, like these are the priorities of our strategic plan, and our borrowing should align.
I think the challenge with that is these decisions may not come up in the term of the strategic plan. Right. So some of these pieces of infrastructure won't be replaced for 30 years, 40 years. So it'll look different at that time. I've reviewed several debt policies before bringing this to council, and I have seen restrictive policies where they have used the term critical infrastructure only. But we have to choose what's right for us and for our community. I mean, I think it would be to our disadvantage to make a decision based on what another community is doing, particularly when we're looking at other items outside of critical infrastructure and what our priorities are as a community. Because this policy is about the community. They are a stakeholder in this, and they will have a role in this debt policy, as well as council, as well as staff. And so when we're looking at these, what we're asking ourselves what we will borrow for, you know, perhaps we need to assess the comfort level of the community on this one. Certainly the community has been vocal throughout public consultation on the budget for borrowing for the wastewater treatment plant, for borrowing for the indirect facility, for borrowing for anything. So this is a question we could potentially get some feedback on, if that would be at all helpful to council.
And thinking that, sorry, did someone have me? Or should I go
I
ahead?
used my hand.
Okay, I'll use my
Mayor, last one, please. I mean, I don't mind going to the community, but honestly, I think most members of the community are pretty short-sighted when it comes to this stuff, and it's how is it going to impact my tax bill today, maybe in 5 years. So the ability to look out 10, 20, or 50 years is a lot more challenging for people, and I think that the council is going to need to take some leadership with respect to that. To what Councillor McMaster said, I don't entirely agree. I don't think leaving certain things to a case-by-case basis that's not the point here. The point here is to provide some parameters around, and again, if it is some kind of tiered thing where we're feeling more certain and agree on this tier 1, like the critical infrastructure, but then, these things are a bit more, we have a little more flexibility, or maybe there's a range implied or something like that, so that we can be a bit more responsive, not knowing where things are going. But I think you've already nailed it when you said it's really critical to review this on a regular basis, because as the political landscape changes, things might change with respect to how much funding you could expect to get from somewhere else, and also how your community changes over time. And again, like just going back to the recreation infrastructure, I could see this community living without an indoor gym for another decade or so, but at some point when the school gym finally gets crushed because they're going to rebuild, we are going to have a conversation about what are we going to do, and if we have a really, really restrictive borrowing policy, and then a future council uses that as leverage. See what it says? It says we can't do this. That's not the point. The point is to, always be looking forward. And
I think we need to, for this policy in particular, is balance the long-term outlook with the short-term. And what I mean by that is we've just borrowed, or we will be borrowing $16 million for the wastewater treatment plant. So perhaps the comfort level to borrow for any other type of infrastructure facility is, it's very low. And
we're in debt shock.
Yeah. And so perhaps for the next 3 years, or perhaps for the, it's going to take us 30 years to pay that off. Maybe in 5 years we'll feel differently and we'll want to expand, or we'll want to make the policy language more flexible with what we're willing to borrow for certain types of infrastructure. So it'll be, yes, we need to look at this as a long-term policy, but we also need to remember where we're at right now and what our comfort level is with borrowing more.
Councillor Anderson.
Yeah, you partly answered my question, because any term of council's strategic plan, it sometimes is responding to immediate things that are whatever happening at election time and in the term of that council. But not all of it is. Like some of the climate change goals are really long term. So I'm kind of thinking that maybe short term borrowing is better for those things that you respond to that are short term in a strategic plan, but maybe long term borrowing makes more sense for the long term goals. considering the strategic plan. But I don't know if the policy needs to address that or not. That's kind of stating the obvious. So that's my comment.
Councillor Stewart.
No, I think, Nyla, in response to the two things that I think Josie, in terms of that community input into this decision, I do think there is some, and I've experienced it in my short term on council, that sort of maybe that more shorter term viewpoint on certain immediate items that come forward. And so I think it is incumbent upon us to show leadership in that area for sure. You know, and I just, you know, the reason I brought up the critical infrastructure, because I view certain pieces of infrastructure as critical, and that's why I was curious as to see what your definition of, you know, and I see it on the board, but I would include, if we were to use that word critical, I could see other municipal infrastructures being critical in that nature. And I think Mayor Osborne alluded to something like recreation as could be considered. If we look at things from a different sort of lens, where the health of my community and the infrastructure that might, water of course being incredibly important, but also those quote intangibles that often don't get talked about in these economic discussions about debt and borrowing, where we don't have a mechanism for including the health and well-being, the mental and physical well-being and health of my community in these kinds of decisions. And so when I look at those kinds of critical infrastructures, I would include things like a rec facility, our parks, and our other sort of quote intangibles, and that's kind of where I was moving with that. So.
Okay. Okay. I just crossed out the word critical. And no, I do agree, and I think where I think the priorities could be set without saying so, or without referring to certain infrastructure in any way to indicate a priority, is in the policy language with our proportions of debt versus grants, or debt versus other sources of funding. I think council would agree with me when I say I think our comfort level with borrowing for water, roads, sewer, and drainage infrastructure is higher than what we would feel comfortable borrowing for municipal hall or a rec facility, or perhaps the multi-use path. I mean, generally the cost of those other projects are significantly more, but based on what we've been doing, I just, you know, quite naturally put a lower reliance on borrowing for the rec facility, because that's just based on what we have done. So I will avoid the use of critical. Thank you for that feedback.
Critical piece of infrastructure being, in some cases, bathrooms, and I'm going to have to.
Did we want to take a 2-minute?
Why don't we take it right after we finish this section?
Yeah, I think, if I may, there's been a couple indications towards debt shock and the complex nature of this and the conversation that will engender, but I think that on a larger scale, I'm really glad to be on a council that's having this discussion, despite the fact that we're having huge discussions about long-term borrowing, and it is massive, and it can feel unwieldy. To be in this conversation right now, I think is so incredibly responsible, and shows a lot of leadership, and I'm really proud to be a part of it.
Okay, so I think what I will take from this conversation regarding what we will borrow for is I'm going to keep the language very general. I will reference all types of infrastructure areas where we could borrow, and I will draft that into the policy. I'll put some language around percentages, but we can pull out what council doesn't like, and we can leave in what everyone's comfortable with. And that won't be for a couple months, so lots of time. So I just have 3 slides left. The last 2 should go fairly quick, but talking about dollar amounts for limits to borrowing just for a moment, to remind council about our statutory limit for borrowing based on 2017 data, and we've seen this number before, is just over 27 million, and that's based on an estimated interest rate at this time. It's not, so depending on what our borrowing, what we would like to borrow for, our borrowing limit may change slightly. So it cannot exceed 25% of specific municipal revenues, and those revenues are established by the ministry when we do all of our reporting at the end of the year. The 2018 data is last I checked, was in draft format, so I wasn't able to update this calculation. So some pending items against this borrowing limit is 16 million for the wastewater treatment plant, the rec facility at close to 3 million, with leaving us a balance of just over $8 million. And so we do need to identify in the policy what our risk tolerance is for borrowing, how close we want to go to that borrowing limit. Is there a percentage? Is there not a percentage? And I mean, I don't know what that percentage or what that number is. I mean, if we have the ability to borrow 27 million, then we could, and we can. I think that when the borrowing bylaw came forward for the rec facility, everyone heard me when I didn't support the recommendation to move forward with that borrowing. But I really wanted to have this discussion, and I really wanted us to ask us that difficult question of will we borrow $27 million or will we not? And I don't expect you to answer that today or this evening, but it is something we need to think about. It is something we need to set parameters around in the policy. But I would be open to any thoughts, initial thoughts on that.
What goes into determining the limit? Is it our revenues, our assets, or does the tax assessment role play into it?
No, it's based on specific revenue, so it's based on reliable revenue sources essentially. I can't list all of ours right now, but I know that taxation is included in that because we have the ability to adjust what that number is and tax for it, so that's considered a reliable revenue source. Any unconditional streams of revenue that we receive in, like the Strategic Community Investment Fund, is included in our calculation. User fees and charges, because we have the ability to amend those, are included as well. So that's just to name a few. And if you would like to know specifically what goes into our calculation, I can provide that at a later date.
And how do we have any idea of how much that limit is changing year to year? Like, just
not off the top of my head.
No, I know, but
I know it's increasing.
It's something we assessed in 2017, but we don't generally assess it year to year.
I always have a look at our borrowing limit each year. I do the calculation when the numbers are finalized by the province. So it is increasing every year because our taxation has been increasing. So as long as that increases, it'll always increase slightly. Very few of those reliable revenue sources are falling away or have decreased, such as user fees and charges. Those are increasing as well.
Would it be valuable to know that as we develop a debt policy? Like to look at the trend of increase, or?
I don't think so. I think in the policy we want general language referencing our statutory limit, and that limit can then change. It can fluctuate, and that's okay if it does increase from year to year. If it gets to a point where it's put us in a high risk tolerant situation, such as if council's comfort level was to only borrow up to 80% of our statutory limit, and our revenues, let's say our taxes increase 20 some odd % in 1 year, we'd maybe want to revisit that percentage to make sure we're still comfortable with what that dollar limit is. That's something I could bring forward through the budget discussions every year.
Councillor,
I think I'm pretty clear on what your level of risk is over this short term we've been. Councillor, you've made that fairly clear. And so I suspect you will have some possible recommendations or definitely some opinions maybe on where that might be. And they're very valuable and I would agree in principle. And I think you've mentioned several times that we will have, and you strongly recommend to come back to review these decisions, and which would answer the question here fairly clearly too. So I'm comfortable having this discussion, obviously, and creating those limits. But I suspect and we do value your opinion on this, what is a comfortable level of risk for you as our Chief Financial Officer, and where maybe as individual councillors we would be able to use some of that information, because I don't really know what, from the running of the municipal finances, what is the comfort level to be able to have in our back pocket if need be, and what we would be free to be looking at in terms of the ability to borrow. And so I think we do rely highly on your opinion on, well, I do, I can't speak for the rest of on this, so a little bit of guidance in that area to help formulate, if there's something specific in terms of a percentage risk, it would be valuable to have a little bit of guidance from you on that.
Yeah, thank you.
Personally.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just some thoughts, and I certainly don't have a comprehensive answer to that tonight, but I need more information to come up with, I think, a good recommendation for council on what I think our risk tolerance is, or what our limits to borrowing should be. I don't agree with allowing us to borrow up to our limit, because I know what our taxes are going to do over the next 5 years, and that would put us in I think a difficult and uncomfortable position for the taxpayers. I need more information on our asset management planning and what our infrastructure in the area, where the majority of infrastructure sits. I need more information on the service life of those assets, and knowing that is going to help me figure out over the next 30 years what are those big pieces of infrastructure that we're going to need to replace, and will we have enough money in our levy and our reserve funds to pay for that. While we will be saving the optimal amount on an annual basis in year 2023, we're still going to encounter a scenario where an asset's going to retire in 10 years and we're not going to have all the money for it. It's going to take time to get to that point where the reserves are built up so that we can face any situation. So I need more information from the asset management plan. We certainly want to, I think having $8 million if we were to borrow for these two outstanding items is good based on past experience, but I don't have enough information to know if that would even be enough if we encountered an emergency where we needed to replace a very important piece of infrastructure. So I need to think about that some more.
Has anyone ever borrowed to the limit and then suddenly needed more money?
I don't know, and that's a very good
I just wonder
question.
what happens.
Yes,
Imagining
You want to try it?
borrowing apocalypse scenarios.
Yes, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I would guess yes. I mean, I believe borrowing limits used to be quite a bit lower because, over the years taxes have increased for all municipalities. So if there was a time where an important piece of infrastructure did need to be replaced, quite possibly there was not enough money.
I mean, it's the old adage, if you're going to go into debt, go big, because then we can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
Can't do it with you. I like where Doug's
City of Detroit probably has some problems with more infrastructure than they need.
Mayor Osborne? Councillors? Councillors?
Okay. Okay, so for borrowing limits in the policy, I'll propose some language in the draft policy. I promise you it'll be on the risk averse side, but that's okay. We can modify that and change it and see what works for everybody. Oh, there we go. It was. Okay, so next steps. So I'll take information from our discussion today, and I think I have enough to do a first draft of this policy. And I will make some suggestions to council, recommendations in the policy to council, and I apologize if I go too far with what I've taken from today's discussion, but we'll certainly have an opportunity to amend anything in the policy if council's not comfortable with the language that's in there. I'll bring it back to a future council meeting. I can't make any promises as to when, but this is certainly a policy I would like to wrap up throughout our financial planning process. It's because it has such a potentially large financial impact, I think it's important to finish up this discussion before May 15th. So in terms of resources, I just put a few up here. I did look at the City of Kelowna's debt policy, their financial principles and strategies document that I shared a little bit of in today's presentation. GFOA has a recommended practice for establishing a debt policy and a debt management policy. I took a lot of information from that in considering today's presentation. City of Winnipeg has a comprehensive debt management policy, as well as District of West Kelowna I had a look at, and City of Edmonton. And so these are larger municipalities. I did look at some smaller municipalities, but as I mentioned earlier, when I was trying to frame this discussion for council and wrap my head around it before I brought it to council, I really wanted to look to larger municipalities who made very big borrowing decisions, because I feel like we just made a very big borrowing decision. So I want to do this. I want to do this properly, and I want the policy to be effective for these very big decisions that we're making with respect to borrowing. So I hope council found that conversation useful today as a starting point for developing a policy, and I will I'll follow up on a later date. If there's any last comments or questions. I think I'm going to get pulled off the stage here very soon.
You might want to look at the City of Airdrie in Alberta.
Okay.
Edmonton's an NDP seat. And Airdrie's a little bit smaller than...
Yeah. Can we to take a small break? Yes? Okay. 2 minutes? Great.
Yawning? That was an exciting conversation.
It's just an hour.
It was great.
I think the small guy.
I'm
They
sorry.
can't do anything about it.
Guys?
Look at Donald Trump.
April was rolling her eyes like crazy. You couldn't see her.
I mean, when you're small, they throw you in prison. When you're big, they keep you working because you don't know you're going to get any money back.
I knew it was going to be.
You know all about that.
You just get it all done in this terms.
Should have asked you.
So you can retire.
Is the idea of at some point in the future, maybe we may have some reserves where it wouldn't be necessary to borrow the entire amount. And that was actually where I started with stress policy. Lister was, is it even though we may have cash on hand,
Leave it to the
when
bird.
interest rates are good,
Think we should bring like our kids here from
like where our bond ladder was doing better
50
than
years, kids.
was
Dawn
before.
was good because we're putting money in.
Yes,
You're not going to see
that's why we
the freeze our legal, but you will
You
stay
will.
in town.
I think that's why we want to have the ability to decide whether if
Hand over that
we
piggy bank.
should we repay the debt.
Yeah, I know you said repay, but
You're gonna pay now or you're gonna pay later?
should we incur it at all if we have money?
Should start a youth tax fund.
Right?
A Youth Ratepayers
Right,
Association.
right, Yeah.
And so,
And rent payers.
And rent
it might
payers.
seem sort of obvious, but we should probably address that somehow.
Yes, we can. I think the way I approach this policy is that it would give us the ability to borrow, but yes, I think when we get to the point of having built up our reserves,
Gender balance
we
is not
likely
switched
want
over.
to put some
Your
of our
council.
reserves around
Oh.
going too far the other way.
He hasn't declared how he identifies every
You're
report.
just making your,
That's
you are
very
making an
important.
assumption.
Yeah.
What?
He hasn't declared who the gender.
Did I declare them?
I don't know, is it anywhere in my last one? Okay, well, you struck the balance that we. You're the deciding gender.
We went to Ricardo asking about water, wondering what they wanted to know. But in her emails, even she puts in bracket,
Okay.
hers, but the pronouns you're supposed to use when you address this.
Like, hey, it's November,
It's a big deal in university.
Yeah, let's hold this committee meeting here, let's do this.
It's
I don't, it's not so
Just skip to the last slide.
Skip to
Any questions?
Find your own header,
I was thinking of an inverse relationship between the capital infrastructure levy and the short-term borrowing.
I don't have general report.
Because my girlfriend
My
had
bad.
help with her, and then right before we started the meeting, I
Short-term
was so she came in again and said, "Maybe I was like, good thing I came when I did." Your dog's head was
Zero was up.
stuck in it.
Before.
Yeah, like in the gap.
Aaron's relocated to see if
Yes.
he can stay awake for his presentation.
Yes,
Oh, he's
but
waiting.
and I think that will work for,
The Councillor McQuaid is going to steal my hot water, so I'm sitting here guarding
we
it.
still need the ability to replace that money for the
There we go.
existing.
Good to get started?
So I think that's where, that would be.
Counselor.
Councillor-elect
But
Law,
to
you don't mind,
borrow-
we're just gonna get started.
Yeah.
We tried to get some more people to come in from the movie, but
It's not
they
really
don't want to.
interested.
Country music, wins all the time.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. I'm going to talk a little bit about the 2019 to 2021 Resort Development Strategy. I'll go through a little bit of background about the RMI program and recent changes to the program for this program term, and then talk about the current funding for Tofino and the projects and programs that have been now approved by the province. This is on the blank a little.
where the batteries are going.
So a resort development strategy is a requirement of participation in the RMI program. It is required to be approved by the Ministry of Tourism, Arts and Culture, and the strategy identifies the specific projects and how the community will achieve the outcomes of the RMI program. RMI is a unique funding program, and it recognizes the infrastructure burden, like we were just talking about, placed on rural communities like Tofino, whose small population supports a tourism economy that contributes significantly to the province. RMI funding is one of the few tourism-funded tools that Tofino has to support the delivery of high-quality visitor experiences. One can think of Tourism Tofino, which is supported by the MRDT, and I'm stealing this from Bob, as the promise makers, and with the RMI, the community is able to help be the promise keepers. So as I said, the program is managed by the Ministry of Tourism, Arts and Culture. There are 14 communities in BC that participate in the program. And the program targets a number of outcomes, which I won't go through them all, but they are on the screen before you, that are related to the development of a strong and sustainable tourism economy. Tofino has participated in the program since 2007, and the program began as a performance-based program that provided funding based on the MRDT generated in the community, so essentially a matching amount. In 2014, the funding each community received began to be proportionately adjusted, and by adjusted I mean reduced, in order to stay within the province's total funding for the program, which was capped at $10.5 million, but that's for all 14 of the municipalities. And there's one municipality that does take up a lion's share of that funding, so we were seeing significant reduction in the funding that we were receiving. By the end of 2012-2016, 2012 to 2016 program term, the future of the program was looking quite uncertain. It was extended first for 1 year into 2017 and then into 2018. There was substantial work during those years that took place behind the scenes. The resort communities collectively did quite a bit of research and lobbied the province for the continuation of the program. There was a core group of resort municipalities that did quite a bit of work, and Mayor Osborne was very involved in that work. So, in the summer of 2018, the province confirmed that the program would continue. They released new guidelines for the program in the fall of 2018, and with a spring 2019 deadline for provinces, or sorry, for communities to submit a new draft strategy. And so in the winter, spring of this year, Tofino developed with the help of our Resort Development Strategy Advisory Group, developed a new strategy. And I'll just point out here too that the program operates on the province's fiscal, so 2019 is actually April of 2019 to March of 2020, and so on. So the program will conclude, or not the program, sorry, the current strategy term will conclude in the spring of 2022. So changes to the program is a new formula, and in response to communities' requests for more stable funding, so the funding's fluctuated quite a bit from year to year, the province has come up with a base funding amount, which is based on an average of the previous 3 years. So you'll see there in the table 2016, 2017, 2018 are averaged to come up with a base funding amount. That'll be the same funding amount that Tofino will receive each year of the 3 year that we currently have an approved strategy for. And then to maintain that performance-based element to the program, we receive a performance lift based on the annual growth of our MRDT from the previous year. So the way that shakes out is from 2017 to 2018, we had an 8.29% growth in MRTT, and so that is applied against our base funding amount. So the total funding that we received this year is the $1,192,944.
Wow.
Is that clear to
everyone?
Yeah.
Well said.
And again, for clarity, the MRDT, our RMI amount is calculated at a maximum of the 2% MRDT. Tofino is one of the communities that has elected to collect 3%, but is not calculated on that additional amount.
So cheeky.
So the Whistler Center for Sustainability, who's worked with the district on a number of initiatives, was engaged to help Tofino through the resort development strategy process. An advisory group of community members and tourism stakeholders was put together to help guide the process with representations from Tourism Tofino, Tofino Long Beach Chamber of Commerce, Pacific Rim National Park, CBT, Clayoquot, and District of Tofino Staff and Council. In addition to the work of the working group, there was an online survey, stakeholder interviews, and the projects themselves were presented for feedback at the date here. The 2019 to 2023 financial plan open house, I want to say the date of that was in February?
February 8th, I think.
Not to be too specific.
As the strategy was developed, linkages, and this is a requirement of the provinces as well, the strategy needs to link into other documents, strategies and plans that a community has. So these are the many related tourism-related strategies and plans that were reviewed. And we look for alignment with those plans and opportunities to implement recommendations that may be appropriate. I know this font is small. I do have the current goals in the larger font in the next slide, so I'll get to that. But I just wanted to show the evolution of the goals that are identified in the resort development strategy from the previous term, which, as I said, was actually 2012 to 2016 with a couple of years tacked on. The goals remained the same. So goals 1 and 2 are essentially very similar in nature between the two terms, which is to enhance the visitor experience as they're interacting with the natural environment, as well as increase the awareness of Tofino's eclectic, and we had about a half-hour discussion about the definition of eclectic, and authentic nature and diverse community character. And then the goals 3 to 4, and I'll switch to the next slide because they're just a little bit larger and easier to see. Building local tourism assets that increase accessibility and promote physical activity. That was a new one. Increase sustainable and responsible tourism practices that minimize climate impacts on our infrastructure, programs, and projects. Strengthen recognition of and partnerships with Indigenous nations in whose traditional territories we operate. And enhance tourism in such a way that aligns with resident, community, and regional values. So some pretty significant changes and more specific details in this resort development strategy than in the previous one. Oh, that didn't... PDF very well. So what it's supposed to show is a pie chart, 2 pie charts. The one on the left is supposed to show that
Orange.
the allocation, the balance between infrastructure and programs and services that are required by the province are that services, programs, and events can be a maximum of 30%, and infrastructure must be a minimum of 70%. So it does remain primarily an infrastructure-based program. Tofino's allocation is, so the resort services are 19%, and that's over the 3-year term, and infrastructure is 81%. So we're still very heavy with building out the infrastructure. When the program was refreshed for this term, another change is that we are now able to use funding for sustainability initiatives and also for emergency preparedness initiatives, as long as they're related to the tourism economy. And again, this is contrasting the previous resort development strategies projects with the new term. So some core programs and projects there that are consistent from term to term. Downtown revitalization, I think we're all very familiar with, remain the same. Water access, beach improvements. We've always used it for trail development because in Tofino, essentially all trails eventually do lead to the water. At least that was our rationale, but we've just clarified that in the language now. Wayfinding signage is not quite so prescriptive now with wayfinding signage, but it's just visitor-oriented signage much more broadly. Arts and culture infrastructure, very similar. Seasonal shuttles become transportation services, as it's just a little bit more broad, it's not so prescriptive, and allows us to be a little bit more responsive to changes as we need to. And event support has become a little bit more broad again with the completion of the Arts and Culture and Heritage Strategy last year. Is now Arts, Culture, Heritage, and Event Programming. 2 new projects that you saw there were transportation infrastructure. So that's brand new, and we are investing a fairly significant amount of money into transportation infrastructure this year with the completion of the 3 transit pullouts. And that it supports the recommendations coming out of the multimodal transportation plan, dovetails really nicely with our transportation services, and just generally looking at people, how visitors move through the community. Education and training, that was something, I'll skip ahead here. Education and training that came out of the working group and is meant to help support initiatives like West Coast Nest that's focused on educational tourism and attracting visitors to the region for that type of activity, but could also be Indigenous tourism training, youth training initiatives to get people involved in the tourism industry and provide that skills training. I'm going to jump back here to sustainability projects. Some of the projects, this is sort of an evolving, still working out some of the details on what this will look like. But again, electric vehicle charging stations, water bottle filling stations, solar upgrades to public washrooms, those are the types of things that we're expecting to see with that project already there. And then just a little more detail on the Arts, Culture, Heritage, and Events programming. That does support our partnership with Tourism Tofino to deliver the event program, as well as the part-time or part of the staff person that's supported through that funding as well as the funding 3 years now committed for the Clayoquot Heritage Museum. And so in conclusion, looking forward to implementing the strategy. It's a guiding strategy. It articulates the goals, the planned projects, programs, and services related to the spending of that funding that Tofino receives. It helps support the district's financial planning process by identifying RMI-funded projects over the program term. It is flexible. It's not set in stone. We do revisit this every year through the budget process, and the province requires us to submit an updated list of projects each year. So there is some ability to change the amounts we're investing or even to add new programs and services and projects as we need to. And it does provide some accountability to the province and to the public with regard to Tofino's participation in the program. The document will be available on the district's website. It is publicly available, along with background information on the program and past projects that have been completed through RMI. And I think I said before, there's extensive reporting that staff does on this program, both quarterly and annually, to and reporting back to how our projects are tying into the objectives of the strategy. Any questions?
It still gets me why we can't charge for policing in this. I mean, when I talked to Bylaw last summer, and they talk about the work it takes patrolling Mackenzie Beach with 200 fires and things like that. I mean, who wouldn't be doing that without all the tourists there?
I think there's a lot of things in Tofino that we wouldn't be doing without all of the tourists there, all the visitors. The province has been fairly wary of operational costs, and we've been through this before. It is primarily an infrastructure-based program. They do see the value in things like event support and cultural development, but I think policing might be a difficult conversation.
Councillor Steer.
Yeah, you know, it's incredible. We have over $1 million to put towards some pretty great projects. Let's be honest. I have just and I don't know if you're going to be able to answer this, April, but in the report committee, when we look about our 2019 to 22 strategic plan, and under the strategic priority, and I'll read it out, just it was to continue strengthening the tourism sector as a sustainable, resilient, and foundational sector of the local economy, and within the limits of the community's environmental and social capacity. And I'm focused on the end part of that, within the limits of the community's environmental and social capacity. And I don't know if we've ever defined what that is, or and maybe we have, and I just haven't been. And I think if we're going to make a statement like that, we should be able to define it and be able to measure it. And I don't know, once again, I don't think we have, and I don't think we're there. And I would really be important to me to know what that is, and to, if we're going to say it, to be able to apply it. And so, like I said, I don't expect you to answer it. I just wanted to, for council, my fellow councillors, and for staff to know that that is definitely on my mind. And I don't know what framework or how we can, or how the resources we commit to finding those answers, but it's something that I would truly like to have answered. And so I don't expect an answer, but the one thing that
but would you like to?
Yeah, unless you really want to. If you have the answer right now, April, that would be great. But the other part is, you know, when we do create these projects, and like I said, I'm 100% supportive, we end up with that asset, just like, say, a school bus stop, for example, that never gets built. But then we are responsible for the maintenance of that over the long period of time. And within the funding structure, I mean, it's great that we create this, but we then end up having to maintain and or operate, whatever it may be. And do you see at any point, or is there some way to wiggle within there that is accounted for when we build these projects out?
That's a good question, and I think that we're very aware of that now as staff, having been through a few years of the program. At one time, there were some operational costs or maintenance costs that we were able to fund for the program. We did actually fund a seasonal staff person to look after landscaping and that type of thing. Unfortunately, that was not part of the program that continued. The province has indicated that there's some appetite for sort of one-time renewal upgrades of assets that were built with RMI. You know, you build a giant wayfinding sign, that wayfinding sign needs an update 5 years in, then that could be considered an eligible expense. But the sort of ongoing maintenance, that you build a washroom and now you need to clean it, I don't think we're having success with that argument.
Yeah, it has moved more the other way toward capital, and so then the maintenance of these assets comes from traditional sources, taxation. So it's something for us to be mindful of as we're selecting where we want to spend this money. Make things as low maintenance as possible to try and protect our future selves a little bit.
And maybe, Mayor Osborne, if, I know you're involved in with discussions with the province, and I know, as you've just indicated, that it is moving, or has moved, more towards that capital. Do you think, is there an appetite within the other resort communities to engage the province more, to bring these issues up, for example, the maintenance and and to bring those? I think we have a fairly receptive provincial government. It's great that it's a budget item.
Yeah, it definitely comes up, and it was a big subject of discussion when we were lobbying the previous government and then the new NDP government to keep the program. Is that this balancing that tension between them trying to achieve their political objectives and us satisfying those so that they will renew the program, and then us trying to blur the edges a little bit so that we could use more money for operational maintenance and things like that. So I don't think it's a dead conversation, but I think it's something that the 14 resort municipalities have been a bit tentative to dive too deep into now in this first year after they've just renewed the program. We're kind of like, thank you very much, and then we'll start needling away again.
We know it's there for 3 years, so maybe this is the time to. Correct.
Councillor Anderson?
I'd just like to add to John's or Councillor Steele's question. The province has to justify this to other municipalities that don't benefit from the resort, the program, and there's some places that come very close to being a resort municipality but still don't get it. So don't get the benefit of the program, such as Parksville is really close to the number of hotel rooms that they have. So there's kind of a, they have to explain to the Parksvilles of the world why they don't get it. So the more that the province goes into the operating funds, I think the less those goals of advancing and increasing tourism are less justifiable to the other communities that don't get it. So otherwise, they would have to sort of expand the program, I guess, to something else altogether. So there's a bit of a political rub there too. I think there's, and I don't know if you hear this much at the resort municipality meetings, but I think there's a certain level of what other municipalities wish they could get that, but it has to be justified politically. So I think that plays into like how much you can push for stuff with the province. Am I sort of expressing that in any
No, you're
coherent way?
absolutely right. There's been a lot of political pressure from a couple of other places, and the province has made it very clear that they're not going to expand the program. So that's in some ways another reason to be careful about the way we discuss the parameters of the program now. So that's okay. Thanks. Thank you, April. It's nice to see this all together in one document. And the thing that there's two things I'm really looking forward to. First is that now that we know the program is here, that we are going to hopefully be able to take a bit of a longer view in some of our resort development strategy planning. And I know that we did a fine enough job with the committee oversight that we had, but I think next time we know we'll maybe take a deeper dive. And to that end, I think what Councillor Steere is saying is really important. And if there is a way that we're permitted to use resort municipality funding to do the community values side of things, if we really want to show that we're fitting within the province's bigger strategic framework, and part of that is sustainable tourism, and it's not just environmental sustainability, but social sustainability and community sustainability, then we need to be able to measure that. And we're not proposing to measure that because we haven't really discussed it too much. And so I think next year with Tourism Tofino's interest in maybe redoing the tourism master plan and having a little more alignment with the RDS the next time we go around. But I think we can't really say that we're you know, all of our measurements are visitor facing, and none of them are community facing. And I think we have to incorporate that in there somehow.
The same thing stood out for me, the community's environmental and social capacity, and our inability to reference any other document that we had that said what that was. And I think, again, you're gesturing towards something that we've talked about a lot, which is limits to growth, and which I think actually this meeting talks about, this particular cow talks about in two places, both our, you know, our financial limits, and then our manager of community sustainability, even in the new OCP framework, talks about our, you know, limits of our water and how we want to think of that. So I think we're like drawing a kind of an outline of what those limits are without naming them specifically. So being able to measure our capacity and resiliency, environmental and social, I think will flesh out that picture. And I really hope that we do have that conversation. But I don't know, we've said that a few times, like I hope that conversation happens. Is there a manner in which to expedite, or like I don't know, like not particularly in this meeting, but as we keep circling around these conversations and saying this is something that we're gesturing to, how do we stop gesturing and put our finger on it, is of interest to me.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the starting place is our future community plan that starts to talk about, okay, what do those limits look like, and what does you know, environment and economy and all those other things, what do they look like, and maybe some of that gets pushed up to a sustainability plan. I'm not sure. One of the things that you may want to look at, if it's important to council, is a more robust monitoring program that looks at, and I apologize for drawing on previous experience, but you know, Whistler started a monitoring program in I think in the 1980s that they had really not much idea why they were doing it, but it's proved invaluable as they've tried to define who they are as a mountain community, not trying to lose natural areas, net loss of natural areas, starting to measure those things. And as you see trends, you say, okay, well, if environment is important to me, and I'm seeing these 5 trends that are happening, what do I want to do about those? What do I want to do about those trends, so I can be true to so we can be true to ourselves for the community that we say that we want to be. So, I don't think we kind of have the data to. We're not currently measuring very well to have a kind of a policy that assists us in quantifying those kinds of things. So that might be something that we want to talk about as the community plan work progresses.
I don't know, it's just mentioned that the Tofino has done this in the past, so we have the community value survey from the early 90s.
25 years ago.
And then we did it again about 3 years ago with the CBT. Well, we lined up, we have something that's based off the community value surveys, but we tried to line up some of those questions, and then we did do a survey on it, which
Did that ever come to council?
it was, I'm just trying to remember why we did that, but I think it was for, it might be for vital signs. But we worked with, I think it was Spark, and what we tried to do was redo that again, and we pushed out all the communities of the region, so it was through the CBT, and we have, the Tofino data came back very, very, it was statistically significant data. We had the most feedback, and what we tried to do through those newer questions was line up with some of the ones from the early 90s, so that you could start getting, be able to compare decade to decade or half decade to half decade. So some of that work about our values is there. It just needs to be picked up and resourced, and then utilized in the way that we see fit. So I just wanted to point that we have done that work.
Yeah, you're tweaking my memory now.
You were highly involved with it.
That's right.
I can't remember why we did it from the end.
But you're right, it was the vital signs, and so it got in there. But what it isn't, is it's not, because 25, 30 years ago we weren't the tourism community that we are now, So yes, it's comparative in a sense, but it's not asking the questions that we need to be asking now.
No, I think
Yeah.
I think you have to expand it.
Yeah.
But if there are some questions there that did relate to how you feel about the community, about the
Yeah.
environment, about those kind of
Yeah.
values we have other than being a resort community, that we could
Community
continue
values.
to.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Great.
One more question. How did the details of the projects, and we have the goals, and so, but how the details of the projects and programs get developed?
So there is further detail. This is just a slide presentation to give you the highlights, but in the report itself, in the resort development strategy itself, there is further detail on each project area. And those are kept deliberately somewhat broad because we want to be able to respond to the community as things change or opportunities as they arise. So while they meet the requirements that the province lays out for us in terms of being somewhat specific, we want to keep them somewhat flexible. These projects, most of them being larger infrastructure projects, come back to council through the budget process. Downtown revitalization, for example. Campbell Street Phase 3 is a perfect example. So we'll undertake a planning phase, come back to council, this is what it looks like, what do you want to do here, go out to the community, what do you want to do here, and then the projects sort of fall out from there in terms of actually tendering and constructing something.
Yeah, just because it's the new goals that are agreed on that I think are greater, the recognition and to partner with Indigenous First Nations and to increase tourism practices and responsibility, and also the emergency preparedness stuff. So I was just wondering what might come up over the course of the plan as it unfolds out of those areas, because it's great to see them there. Anyways.
Vertical evacuation tower with a bingo parlor below.
Is that to increase the tourism experience?
And emergency.
Did you want me to go back to the presentation? Nope, I think it's Erin's turn, so yeah, I think we want Erin's presentation.
So we can use the easy way, we can use the hard way. The easy way is just ask the questions, then we all go home in 5 minutes. So I have a fairly brief presentation to run through, and happy to take questions as we go or wait to the end. I'm just basically going to walk through the process that we're in with the OCP, where we are today, and what's before council today, and then where we are headed the next couple of months. This will be the first time that I'm in front of council with actual words on a paper, and sort of intent is to bring council back 3 chunks of this. So this first part A, and then part B, and then part C. Check back with council. Following this meeting, I'm starting to set up meetings with First Nations, various stakeholders, and probably a couple of open houses over the next month. And so what I hear back tonight, if anything, or in the next couple of days, feel free to email me. That'll also get all sort of refined into this, and then from that I'll start developing the next 3 sections. So I think I just said it, my entire PowerPoint in 1 minute, but I don't want to give you the PowerPoint anyways, because you deserve it.
It's not very nice.
That's on the thread. You deserve this.
It's late.
You get the PowerPoint user.
Sorry.
Is it a flu shot?
This is the amount for death policy, just so you know. Okay, so we're going through the OCP process, and at the very beginning we set out a number of steps that we wanted to work through. Right now we're sort of midpoint between step 3 and step 4. That's highlighted in the report that council has in front of them today, or committee as a whole has in front of them today. So we started this quite a while ago, in 2017. and we sort of ticked along slowly over the last couple of years. We got slowed down a little bit late last year when our planner Dan Hawkins left us, and it was a bit of just a time to sort of batten down the hatches and do some training, and so we lost probably about 6 months of good work that we sort of planned to do. So early in this past July, I got back into it pretty seriously, and that's kind of led us here to today. Here's a graphic of us between steps 3 and 4. Again, what we said, we went through Planetpalooza late last year, just roughly about this time. We drafted parts 1 to 3. That's done. That's in front of council. The next steps, so the next month, again, as I said earlier, we go into First Nations, stakeholders, some public meetings, and then what will happen is we'll redraft this section to get something that feels like it's responsive to what council and what the community has said. At the same time, I'll be drafting parts 4 to 7. That work is significantly underway, and so what I hear back from today and over the next month will feed into that process. So I expect to have parts 4 to 7 back to council. It would be December, but December is kind of a funny month for the municipality, so it'll probably be January for 4 to 7. And in the meantime, hopefully in December, I'm starting to write 8 to 12, which actually should go quite quickly. And so it's my hope after this consultation and redrafting process is be back in front of council hopefully in February or March with an OCP for a first reading that hopefully everybody's had a chance to have some input in. After it comes back for first reading, it goes to Finance Department and for a waste review. Nana and I are working on some timing for some meetings to talk about that earlier so that we can make sure that process is fairly smooth. I don't believe there'll be, I've talked to the ACRD about the waste review, and I don't think it'll be anything to worry about. We'll have some open houses and a public hearing. And then move on to second and third reading adoption. So hopefully we can have this all kind of neat little bow in May and then jump on to the floodplain bylaw. So just a really brief recap of what was the immediate process right before today. We had an event last year called Planetpalooza. We had booths for any number of district plans. That was the end of a big planning cycle for us. We had quite a few attendees and a lot of survey, and we got some good feedback from the community. We heard that the visions and principles of the existing OCP still resonate, and so we use those to sort of adjust what we have, but not to stray too far from those principles. We found that there's a lot of support for the current policies and practices. That we found a lot of support for the CAC policy, the idea that we look at residential development ahead of anything else. A lot of support for residential development, retail, commercial, and light industrial. There was significantly less support for commercial accommodation over the next 5 years, and a lot of support, sort of going back to this values conversation, for sustainable, measured, and responsible growth. So the things that people supported 6 years ago, and I would even say 20 years ago, still seem to ring true from what I'm hearing from the community, and so but to that point, it would be nice to measure this. So like I can say what it feels like and what we've written, but if we start thinking about measurables, it will probably help us long term. So the part A, which we're discussing today, is the plan overview, and that just sort of sets the stage for where we are, what an OCP is, and how to use it. I worked with a number of OCPs that have been created recently. Dan and I did a bunch of research. I found one that really resonated for me a lot, and so I've referenced it through the development, but was the Kimberley bylaw. It was very simple. It's recent. It's a sort of a mountain town. It's small. I found it was an excellent document to refer to. So the framework of this OCP was reconciliation, water, and the vision to action plan. So this will be the first OCP that we've created truly under the V2A. We did sort of a side by side on the last go around. So this is based on the original V2A. We talk about values and the context and our important relationships. So part 1, sorry, section 1, part A, is planning, lots of 4.1.3.7-8s. So section 1, what is an OCP? We describe what an OCP is. We talk about our vision to action, our truth and reconciliation commitments, water, the intent of this OCP, how to apply it, and how to interpret what's inside of it. It also describes associated plans and the consultation efforts that we have taken in support of that OCP. So that part of the bylaw you see is all still highlighted in yellow. That's because that hasn't been finalized yet, and so it's just more of something for me to make sure I get back to following the consultation over the next couple of months. Section 2 is pretty short. It just talks about the vision. The vision comes directly from the V2A, and I think it was important to sort of maintain that connection to that document. Also in section 2 is our guiding principles. You have the full sort of descriptions in the package in front of you, but there are 7 that we've brought to the community, and so they are reconciliation. And a lot of what this writing, I just stop here for a really brief second, but with reconciliation, as I've been writing OCP, I've been trying to bring more and more of our conversations and our discussions about our relationships with the Tolkien First Nations in particular, but to all First Nations, to the forefront of a lot of what's happening in OCP. So if you'll notice in sections 4 to 7, a lot of our policy starts out with policies that are directly related to that relationship. I think it's one of those things that if we're going to talk reconciliation, we really need to have it forefront in our OCP. Again, affordable, attainable, available housing for all. That's an easy one. Conservation, natural environment. Yeah, oh God. Somebody else can say that.
Authenticity.
Thank you. Community well-being, sustainable local economy, and resilience. And again, these sort of guiding principles go back to the values that we've spoken about in other ways this evening. The context. So this is where sort of the meat of the OCP is for this section anyways, is where we sort of talk about who we are, where we come from, whose land we're on, and who's been here before us. So this starts out with the Tolkien First Nation. So a really brief history talks about residential schools and how that impacted the Tolkien First Nation, the housing and Heshwick communities. It talks about then non-Indigenous settlement, including the Japanese settlers, which we haven't mentioned really before in the past. And then it gets into sort of, the meat and potatoes of planning, how much land do we have, what's on it, where it is, and so that sort of sets the stage for some of the policy that we're going to develop. While I'm developing the next sections, every time I write a policy, I ask myself, does this policy affect land in some way? And so what I've tried to do is stay away from policies that are very, very broad in nature or have a lot of feelings. So I just want to make sure that we're tying together land use with our values and only that, and trying to stay away from things that are better in a resort development strategy or better in an arts, culture, and heritage master plan or a tourism master plan. This is just for interest's sake. This is our land. This is what Tofino's made up of. We have a lot of ocean. But when you're outside the ocean, our land base sort of breaks down like this. And so you can sort of see that we have a lot still of open areas, a lot of forest lands and big parcels. There is a fair amount of large lot residential and suburban lots. Commercial accommodation, so that would be our resorts, take up only about 8% of our land area. You can sort of see, which I think I found most interesting here was our residential, like our true residential, and I'll call it that because other than R1, those are rarely short-term rentals. Only take up 3% of our land. I just found that interesting in comparison to some of what resort lands take up. And granted, those are bigger lands and that invite a bunch of people, but it also plays into that conversation about what do we value and who's getting that land or has that land currently. There's some population highlights in there from census. we've grown roughly at a net rate of 3.2% per year, an annual rate for the last 20 years. The last 5 years, and this is, 5 years related to 2016, was about 0.7%, so we saw a pretty significant slowdown in the last 5 years. I'm not quite sure what that is. It might be that we just don't have the we don't have the houses for people to live in, for people to be counted. So the people might be here, but they might be living in, they might be underhoused or living 12 to a house. We know the unofficial population is significant. We tried to put rough brackets around that to sort of just at least have it in the conversation. And then we talked about future development, and that a lot of that came back to what we heard from the community to Planapalooza. This was what we did here at Planapalooza, so you can sort of see we sort of asked you what would they mostly support or not support or fully support. And if you just sort of look at the green, you can sort of see what was most important to the people that came out to Planapalooza or happened to put a survey in there, and it's pretty clear that the community is interested in more residential development. What does that mean? So, depending on what we heard at Planapalooza, that we heard sort of in the range of 100 to 200 new units in the next 5 years, and this is just community wishes. This is what people say they think they want. That's a 2 to 4% growth. That sort of lines up roughly with what we've been growing anyways. Our wastewater treatment plant also has numbers for the next 2020, so we looked at those. And then we also know we have water constraints, and so we looked at that a little bit as well to sort of start trying to put a fine point on what we think we might want to grow by in the next 5 to 10 years. Interesting about water too is based on the Econics water report from 2014, that water demand is driven into by visitation and less by the residential use. So for housing, we also looked at the housing needs assessment, which told us that we were underbuilding based on the need that we've discovered through that process, and that not only are we underbuilding, that affordability is an issue. So that what we are building, or what we have been permitting, tends not to be affordable for the majority of the people who are looking for places. So it's not just that we don't have the housing, it's just that we're not dealing with the affordability issue yet. But we haven't been dealing with the affordability issue. So in the end, we sort of came up with an option, and again, this is all for discussion, and we're going to vet it through yourselves and also through the community, but that if we just stuck to a simple linear to that line of 3.2% growth, we're looking at about 400 people or 165 units over the next couple of years, and that we do have enough water based on the demand, based on our water supply, we have enough for that type of growth. That being said, if we think about adding on new resorts, there's at least 2 of a campground in the queue. We have Surf Grove Campground coming online. We have another resort that looks like it may want to build out. We have Hotel Z that didn't fire up this year. We have McQuinna, which was closed all year. We have Duffin Cove that's heavily closed all year. We have the new Duffin Cove that we're just through the permitting process for. Is that we have to really consider, we have enough water for that right now today for that extension, but if we continue to move forward with commercial accommodation at the pace that we have, that may be where we start running into issues of water capacity. And so the question is this a time to slow down commercial accommodation, potentially look at down zonings to sort of limit that? And again, this is not a forever thing. This is for us to sort of, I would say, right the ship, focus on what we need to focus on, and then if we work through some of the infrastructure constraints that we have, when we have the new Okamos reservoir expanded, if the water treatment plant is able to produce more water, if we develop more storage on the side, then we start talking about commercial accommodation. And also being said is that we could write in the OCP that we're going to focus on residential as opposed to commercial accommodation for the next years. And if someone really feels like that wasn't the right way, they can also come back to council and community and say, I'd like to do an OCP amendment to change that. It does make it a little bit more difficult, but it's not that we're shutting that door. We're just saying these are our values and that's what we're going to focus on, and then we go from there. So past 2023, 2024, how we upgraded that system. We do have the reservoir, I believe the reservoir is in the 5-year financial plan now. Yeah, so that again, we take a look at that, how much extra liters did we get? Have we had a really successful conversation with Cermak so that they've decided to produce water a month, or produce fish a month later, and allowed us to develop some more residential or some more resorts. I think part of the conversation that we'll have, finance and Nyla and myself will have, is about, what's reasonable, what is in the five-year financial plan, and go forward from there. So today, this is the introduction to council. Again, I'm going to take any feedback I receive this evening and feed it back into the process, and then start the consultation process with the community, and then the drafting of Part B. As I explained earlier this evening, that work has already started. I have enough that it's set with a pretty tight framework, and it won't take a lot of editing to bring that into line, I don't think. And that's it. That's what I have. Looking for any feedback, because the only people that have ever seen this are Dana Hawkins, because I've been employing her as a consultant, Peter Thick, and Mr. Bob McPherson. No one has really said anything about that. I feel like I've been offered writing in a cave for a while, and so any feedback I get would be even the bad feedback. Pretty much appreciated.
Raspberry, would you like to start?
Sure. First of all, thank you. It's really great to see this, and I think that the thing that I like about this the most is the principles. I really, it just such a strong backbone that makes this already 1,000 times better than the last OCP, and I feel really good about it. The principles are okay. So on the reconciliation side, I still think though it needs a little bit of more, I don't know, crafting of words or thought and around intention. I think the Indigenous reconciliation lens that's put out through it, I think it needs a little bit more discussion and thought, but I can't have that right now.
No, and it's a great point. Like,
yeah,
one of the issues that we've had over the last couple of years is being able to engage with the nations about this.
Yeah.
And so part of this was just to write it, and then in the same way we're going to present it, and then adjust.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And I think there'll be some adjustments to make.
Right.
But as the first draft, I think it's fantastic that way. I really don't have much else to say about it. I mean, I think that I think that it accurately reflects what I heard when I was at all of the consultation events that I went to, in terms of where the community views itself and where it's heading with respect to growth and its feelings around commercial development and the focus on housing and all that. So yeah, I think it's ready for good further discussion with other groups. Thank you. And my 2 bits.
Councillor Anderson.
My feedback was similar around the language, and I think Councillor McQuaid also mentioned something earlier about using the word our neighbors and so on isn't it the exact language we want to use. So yeah, so it's great. It's now that we have so many other plans in place, I'm really glad. I was kind of at first reticent about making it a strictly land use document. Now I really see the value of it, so that's great. Yeah.
As I wrote this, there was so much internal resources to pull from. Just on the amount of plans that we've generated in the last 10 years, there's a lot of information out there.
Thank you. Councillor Scheer.
Yeah, I did focus on the guiding principles as a document. I'm not going to bore with anymore, just to reiterate what Mayor Osborne and Councillor Anderson. And I'm looking forward to some of the aspects of some of the more in the next phase, and some of the legislative requirements around climate change. And I think there is we have certain targets that are required for you to put in the plan, and I'm looking forward to having those guiding principles. But there are some legislative requirements that have to be in there that I'm very curious to see how we're going to flush those out. Climate change was one, and then through our water infrastructure and stuff. So anyways, thank you.
Yeah, I thought it was a good effort. I don't really have anything to add.
E for effort or an A for effort?
G.
I think the only thing that Councillor Anderson already gestured was that our lesson on language the other day had been regarding calling our First Nations stakeholders and neighbors. And anywhere that they were called neighbors here, grammatically it could just be removed and then the names could just stand in their place. But honestly, that was literally the only thing that I pulled from it that had a flag. Otherwise, I think it'll take a little bit more digesting than the week allowed. But I think it's incredible and a great start. Anyone has any further comments?
Is that as anticlimactic as you expected?
I had no idea. You sit with something for so long by yourself, you just don't know anymore. You just like, is it good? Is it bad? It's nothing. I don't hate it when I read it, so I don't know.
It's good. Great.
I read it and I was sure somebody else wrote it, so it must be pretty good.
Nice.
I got Peter to copy it. I didn't know. Okay, I will definitely take a look at that, the reconciliation and the language around First Nations, for sure. I did not call them anybody from nation stakeholders today, because they are definitely not stakeholders.
Yeah, rights holders.
Yes.
I think it captured it pretty well, and that speaks to the amount of work that you went out and did with the Planapalooza and the street OCP processes and that input. So
It's just taking a long time.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think it worked well.
Okay.
I will say, though, with the on the front page, the little blurb that's situated on the rugged West Coast, blah blah blah. I happened to be reading another community's plan on something else today, and it was like almost word for word the same.
Oh, no, they're all
It was
the
like
same.
Canmore or somewhere like that. So maybe didn't have a coast, but yeah.
A hellish land, denuded of trees, dead fish floating upon the beaches. We live.
Socially, environmentally, and economically diverse.
Can't wait.
Charlie Brown
Anyhow.
teacher.
That was the original version?
How many more? Welcome to X-Town. Live, work, play. It's everywhere.
And now that we all have the giggles, is there any unfinished business?
No.
Question period? Councillor-elect Law. Read the room.
Actually, I have a question, a little question and a comment for April.
Oh, I was off the hook there.
Yeah, you're all falling asleep and
Yeah.
listening quick, but how long have we had, this is a quick question and then I have a comment and then another question. How long have we had a free shuttle?
We've had a free shuttle in some form or fashion. It used to be two 15-passenger vans that ran the route. I want to say 2008 was the first one.
It's been free since 14, I think.
It has been free since 2014.
And this is my comment, and then I will have a question, is we have a proposed public transit system, and I noticed that if it was rolled out today, it would cost the taxpayers of Tofino about $194,000 a year. I think that's what the fellow said. I have that written down, but somewhere around
268 actually.
That's worst case. He told me that if they rolled it out today, it would be like, just under 200,000. So 200,000.
Got it.
Right. So the municipality is paying right now out of our revenue for the free shuttle
through RMI.
If you look
It's
on
funded, right now,
if you look here, it says municipal funding is 120,000 paid parking revenue, 45,000 community works funding, 15,000 taxation.
it's RMI funding is, oh, are you looking in the budget in the resort development
Yeah.
strategy? So those numbers are over the 3-year term.
So that's total RMI funding is, or total cost projection is 665,000, that's 3 years.
I want to get to your page there and just,
Yeah, it's a 3-year budget.
3-year budget.
So that's 60,000 from municipal funding.
You mean of taxation?
Well, it goes paid
Or-
parking, community funds, and 15,000 of taxation.
So in this budget, it's, the total RMI funding is the 465,000, and that's over 3 years. And so then there's $120,000, and these are estimates, because it's preliminary, of pay parking revenue, so that's 3 years worth. And then 45,000 community works fund, so that's funding, and we've actually, even since this plan was developed, made a few changes there. We're moving away from using gas tax wherever we can, so that it can be used for other purposes. But that's community works funds is gas tax funding. And then 15,000 of taxation.
To 5,000 a year from taxation. But
Yeah,
it's
and
still,
this year, we actually, because we received more RMI than we anticipated when this program plan was drafted, we were able to not use any taxation.
right, but it's still 60,000 annually from municipal funds.
The pay parking revenue?
Well, these are municipal funds, right? So this is.
But maybe this is a deeper question.
Yeah.
Well, my point, this was my question,
Okay.
was that, and then you can clarify, this is because, you know, I'm just asking this.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm looking at it, I'm asking, so is we have, in a sense, the possibility of duplicating services. So we have a tourist-focused service, transportation service that's free, that's duplicating what we're trying to do for a public service.
So, okay, I understand where you're going.
So
I
I'm
think
just wondering, like,
there's plenty of time for discussion. It's going to be 2 years before transit starts, and the routing and the timing and
Yeah, yeah.
everything isn't totally solidified yet. I would argue they actually are doing 2 different things,
I
but
think
whether
so.
whether there can be a way that they meet up at the info center, for example, and people could transfer over and we could save money all around, it's not off the table.
gotcha. That's what
But-
I was just wondering about that.
The
'cause
shuttle is,
reading
just
this
remember
and-
the shuttle is 2.5 months a year, and transit will be year round.
That's good.
I think one question conversation we've had, or we're going to have too, will be with the school board as well.
Yeah,
So that the funding that we're using for
the late bus.
the late bus and stuff, that might be a better option to fund the transit system. Because you can have a late bus.
For hooligans.
That's good, yeah, I just wanted a little clarification, but how is that meshing together, what's the
Yeah,
plan for that?
to be determined.
To-
And also the transit's being run by BC Transit through the ACRD, and the shuttle is run by the District of Tofino, so it just takes a
Yeah,
little
it's
more.
very different. It's very
little more.
different, yeah. Thanks.
That's okay. And can I have a motion to adjourn, please?
Move to adjourn.
Second. All in favor?
Thank you, Councillor McQuaid.
Oh, thanks.
On that, that reminded me of a question I wanted to ask. The expansion of transportation for the systems, is that when we could
Transportation infrastructure?
I don't know if our transportation infrastructure covers that all.
It's a good after meeting.
It's come up, but we haven't.
Thanks for that clarification. I read it, that's good.